Life goes on as usual. Some scurry through the streets of the city. Others work, trying to earn money for their carefree old age. Our protagonist, Jim, was spending time at a pool club with his boss named Michael. They spent most evenings together since the deputy director did not tolerate rejection of his assistant. And so the main character tries to hit the ball, but misses, which undoubtedly disappoints the office worker. However, Michael reacted with a storm of laughter, after which he asked about the man's skills because he had great doubts. Jim scratched his head awkwardly, talking about his bad luck in the game while praising his immediate superior. Waving the cue, Michael compared the loser to low-grade impenetrable beef because the difference in the score was simply huge. His words were followed by a blow with a wooden product directly on the face of the main character. The place of the blow burned weakly, but the humiliation was great. The chief's face did not express sympathy, only bewilderment. The man believed that the interlocutor could easily dodge and thereby prevent the blow. As the players began to gather, the subordinate humbly listened to advice about caution and his own awkwardness. After that, he heard a question about the reason for his desire to climb under his arm. This phrase was said in a voice full of aggression and condemnation. The boss was going to visit the bar, the bill in which would be paid by the loser. This was an excuse to disinfect the victim. After the eventful events of the evening and a large amount of drinking, it was not surprising that the main character felt bad. His stomach could not withstand so much alcohol, and thoughts crept into his head about how a man became a slave to such a man as Michael. Jim remembered that if you don't see an idiot at the gaming table, it must be you, and life is like one big gaming table. The next morning, the main character handed in one of the reports on the work done, and the boss was very dissatisfied with it. He scolded the employee in front of everyone, talking about the lost money of the company and the uselessness of his assistant. Michael did not skimp on insults, although he did not even read the first page of the document, which had already been remade several times. His voice grew louder with each sentence. Discontent permeated every word. Then the papers flew straight into Jim's face. The man did not understand the reason for such an attitude. He listened humbly, waiting for the end of the conversation. He understood that objections would lead to even greater humiliation. Although the reports were carried out correctly, they were not read for the only reason: it was hatred. As Jim collected the sheets scattered around the office, he thought about the reason that could have caused such emotions in his direction. When our hero was sitting at the table, a sharp pain pierced his head, which appeared unexpectedly. The thought of imminent death flashed through the head of the worker. At this time, another worker came up, mentioning the photocopier, which was constantly broken. She asked to fix it. Although this request was not at the right time, Jim agreed to help. He stood up abruptly and was about to walk in the right direction. But the girl screamed loudly. She saw blood on the face of her colleague, which she informed him about. Her face expressed strong feelings about the hero's well-being. Involuntarily, my hand reached for my nose to check, and indeed, the scarlet spots stood out in contrast against the fair skin. The incomprehension was reflected in the man's gaze, but his lifestyle of constant drinking, smoking, and stress could not have led otherwise. Suddenly, his heart skipped. The pain moved to his chest, his legs buckled, and Jim fell to his knees in the center of the office. Most of his colleagues immediately went to him to help. Everyone was worried about his condition. Someone called an ambulance. Only Michael's face expressed dissatisfaction with the current situation. He did not need unnecessary noise during the work process at all. This behavior angered the main character. He did not pay attention to the workers crowded around him, looking only at the face of the boss. Before the fall, Jim thought only about the fact that he was dying precisely because of his slavery to Michael and a lifestyle filled with bad habits. Soon an ambulance arrived. The victim was put on a stretcher and promptly loaded into a car standing at the main entrance. A mask with a respirator was applied to the face, and the medical worker diligently pumped oxygen to improve the patient's condition. In this state, Jim saw his boss yawning. This sight did not fit the situation at all. The dissonance that has developed caused a violent reaction from the main character. He spent his best years on a man who did not care about him. Only when he was on the verge of death, the main character decided to object and express the words of dissatisfaction that had accumulated over so many years. He grabbed the boss by the collar of his shirt and with bitter tears, began to blame Michael for everything. Colliding foreheads, the two angry men argued aggressively. The deputy director was accused of alcoholism and regular beatings. Over and over again, Jim repeated that he was dying because of him, Because it really was, even on weekends, the boss called and overwhelmed with work. Michael could not remove the hand that grabbed him, because even a dying person is terrible under the influence of adrenaline. Jim had a desire to die beautifully, but the circumstances could not allow him. He threw his opponent aside. The landing turned out to be hard. The boss hit his tailbone hard, but the pain faded after further arguments of the main character. From his lips poured out a stream of words, denouncing the cynical man. The truth was revealed to everyone that Michael's promotion was obtained only because of the transfer of internal documents of the workers' union to the leadership. The boss jumped up, dissatisfied with the fact that an ordinary employee revealed the unpleasant truth about him to the whole team. However, he had already managed to be surrounded by people who did not understand why he did this. Others in anger shouted about his guilt in the death of the previous chief. Under pressure from people, the boss decided on a desperate act. He jumped on a stretcher and covered his employee's mouth with his hands, persuading him to discuss it in private. Colleagues were able to drag him away, after which the doctors immediately began to check Jim's condition, but he continued to talk about the company's embezzlement, the reason for which was Michael's riotous lifestyle. The main character said that he was forced to do all the dirty work, but the strength gradually left the weakened body. The deputy director could not calm down, continued to threaten the employee, promising reprisals even after death. He threatened to report to his superiors that Jim's death was not an accident at work, and the salary due to him would not be paid. But after all that had been said, the deputy's face changed. He was perplexed. Even the hand he had been pointing at the assistant all this time lowered, and it was clear why. Jim gave him the middle finger and smiled, pleased with the confusion of his hated boss. Being sent to an unpleasant place, Michael began to insult the assistant with renewed vigor, but it was too late. The victim's face was relaxed and his eyes were glazed. The doctors were screaming and trying to bring the main character back to life. But all in vain. The screams of people, the panic of colleagues, and the efforts of doctors. None of this could bring Jim back to life. Suddenly, the main character woke up. It was like a sharp awakening after a nightmare. Looking around, he could not understand what was happening, where he was, and why he did not die, because he clearly remembered his last minutes in darkness. On the calendar, he had March of 2000 in his hands, and Jim himself was in the room where he lived in high school. The guy still did not realize what was happening, but he decided to go to the wall mirror and examine himself. He didn't understand why a younger version of him was looking at him in the reflection. Now he looked like an 18-year-old schoolboy. His attention was attracted by a sticker pasted on the mirror frame with his mother's handwriting, which said that his parents had left him with food in the refrigerator. In Jim's mind, a complex puzzle was slowly beginning to form a complete picture, but he wanted to be sure of his conclusions. After leaving the room, he walked down the corridor and into the living room. It was clearly his family's home, where he had lived most of his life. But one question continued to spin in his head: why he did not die but returned to the past, and how he managed to do it. It all looked more like the plot of some movie. So he made an appointment with his childhood friend, who was surprised by such urgency. Jim ran to hug his comrade as soon as he saw him. Ethan did not immediately have time to react to such a violent reaction of his comrade. Tears of joy came to Jim's eyes. It seemed that he had not seen his best friend in 100 years, while for the guy opposite only one day had passed. The young man perceived the emotions of the main character as a quick recovery after breaking up with his girlfriend, which greatly knocked down his friend. The main character began to remember his breakup with the first love in his life, which he considered beautiful in everything. Her name was Leah, and it was after a relationship with her that he began to smoke. He could not cope with this addiction until his death. After a strong hug from a friend, Jim decided not to miss the chance that fell to him by a happy coincidence. Such an opportunity is one in a million. He was sure that if it was not a dream, he would live a completely different second life, change his fate, and reach completely new heights. Nothing could spoil the happy moment of the protagonist's unity with himself. The day promised to be interesting, and the two happy friends continued on their way. The final realization overtook Jim already at home. He died and was able to return to the past, but he cannot hope for luck, although he knows the future. His past dreams of wealth have turned to dust. The future he knows can change. You can't be sure of it. You should use your mind and not the knowledge that you have left after death, as they say. If you want to live, you need to be able to spin. The main character needs to throw away all regrets and build his future anew. He is lucky, and you need to appreciate it. He decided not to waste time, but to act, otherwise everything could repeat itself, and he would die young again. Looking at old photographs, Jim recalled how as a child he dreamed of becoming a popular football player, professional gamer, or writer. But now he's in high school, and he's too old for that. His current goal is just one word, it's studying, because he wants to switch places with Michael one day. The next day after school, when the sky was lit up by dawn, Jim told Ethan about his desire to study hard. His friend did not immediately believe his words. They both often skipped extra classes and never worried about grades. The protagonist's decision to devote all his strength to his studies caused his friend to suspect that he was not feeling well. Jim pushed away his classmate's hand stretched out to take the temperature, a reaction he didn't like at all. He firmly stood his ground. School children tend to be engaged in learning and strive to pass exams excellently. His attitude to school has changed. However, the friend continued to persist, offered to go to a computer club, and abandon a useless activity that does not bring joy. Jim's hands folded into a cross of stationery, a gesture that clearly indicated his unwillingness to continue the discussion. Ethan's requests were not heard, which did not suit him completely. He wanted to have fun for the rest of the day, playing with his best friend. The main character decided that he was indispensable for his friend, and this is the reason for such obsessive behavior. But it turned out that he was the only one whom Ethan managed to beat in computer games. His friend did not stop the flow of unflattering words. Jim's classmates' statements hurt Jim greatly, but working for Michael, he learned to control his emotions and facial expressions. By threatening to lose his friendship, although he did not want it, the main character hoped to stop Ethan's attacks. He immediately let go because he understood the seriousness of his classmates' intentions. Such an argument shocked him and made him calm down. Approaching the others, Ethan began to explain the situation that they would have to go without a friend because he was too busy studying and stood his ground. Such arguments did not convince his comrades. They doubted that such a lazy person as Jim would not take his head and begin to study seriously. The guys wanted to reason with the main character. They did not want to leave him sitting at the desk. It was not in their habit to be separated. The unofficial leader of their company decided to use a different method of persuasion. He abruptly grabbed a red pen. No one immediately understood what the impudent man was going to do. The situation was getting more and more tense. He clicked the handle and began to act. A clear line of red drew the textbook of the main character. Who did this? He smiled impudently, pleased with his act. Jim gritted his teeth, his cheekbones playing on his face, clearly not expecting this from people he considered his friends. All the work done with such difficulty was ruined. It will have to be redone, and in addition to this, you will also have to explain to the teacher the reason why the book is in such a condition. Jim couldn't control his emotions. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his desk and chair, his school supplies collapsing to the floor. It was worth putting an end to this unpleasant conversation, which our main character did, telling his classmates to get out, otherwise nothing good would happen. The three friends did not expect such a reaction. They were just joking. But sometimes jokes go beyond all boundaries. Soon the office was empty. Jim realized that in the past, he was comfortable for everyone and did not study well. You could expect such behavior. But now the main character is determined to change. He will not please anyone and will never allow him to be mocked. Later, solving mathematics, it was difficult for him, even from the height of the years he had lived. He could not understand everything the first time. The class teacher came into the classroom. It was a stern man who always carried a bat with him, the name of which was Excalibur. Although it was late, students had to stay to do their homework or prepare for lessons. The teacher rarely checked the classrooms and visits, but now he wondered who from his class decided to skip. The head man, distracted from his notebook, raised his hand and said that some students had left the school and gone to the computer club. The teacher's determination was amazing. He found out where his wards were going and hurried to find them. Soon all truants were returned to the educational institution and had to be severely punished for the offense committed. Having dealt with one student, the class teacher called Ethan next. Although he did not tremble in front of the teacher, but he still did not want to receive punishment. The main character looked at what was happening with understanding. When it was supposed to happen, they can't be tipped forever. By chance, the teacher's gaze caught on Jim. The severity on his face changed to bewilderment. Instantly, the bat changed direction and began to point at the main character. A stern male voice asked why the guy was sitting at the desk and not waiting for punishment along with the others. The student shrugged his shoulders. He did not do anything wrong because after the lesson, he remained in the office and continued to study as he should. The teacher compared the broken-up group of friends to his favorite baseball team, which had recently disbanded. This day made him surprised. Memories of the team and idols, whom he was a big fan, made the man move again. A miserly tear flowed down his rough face. Preparing for the blow, the teacher began to shout the names of the players of his favorite team at the top of his voice. Strong emotions caused a wave of adrenaline, and the blows were stronger than before. Ethan begged for mercy. Even on the way home, the impact site still hurt a lot. Ethan could barely move his legs, and Jim had to help him. All the way, the victim grumbled strongly at his friend, calling him a traitor because he did not support them, which upset the teacher even more. The main character explained that he warned his friends and asked him not to go anywhere. Ethan pushed him away from him in response to the comment. The young man did not understand what goal his friend was pursuing, what he wanted to achieve if he began to worry about studying. Only Jim himself realized that it was worth striving for the best, because in the past he was a civil servant. This time he wants more. The main character adhered to the ancient wisdom, if you wrap incense with paper, it will smell of it. The same with people. When one person changes, the environment changes with him. He is able to influence his friends and will start today. Jim's mood greatly influenced Ethan. He began to think about studying, whether it was worth trying and what it would lead to. After a while, the results of the intermediate exams came. Our hero took 5th place in terms of academic performance in his class. Everyone began to congratulate him. No one expected such high results from their changed classmate. Only the class teacher doubted such a quick success of his student and expressed doubt about the honesty of such results. He couldn't help but notice that Jim was sitting next to the headman, who was one of the best students in the school. But even such a bore as Austin could not answer anything about this. His arrogant nature could not be hidden even by excellent marks. The main character had not been in contact with him before. Perhaps that is why the smart guy decided to check if Jim really practiced. In this situation, it was impossible to get angry, because then the teacher would doubt the student's progress even more. In view of this, it remained only to say that the work was written honestly. Austin could not frame his classmate, which made him very upset, although time is on his side. But there is no evidence. He should only worry about his admission to the university. After the bell rang, the students ran down the corridor. Everyone was doing their own thing. Most were discussing recent results. Ethan decided to ask his best friend about the reason for his poor academic performance. But sometimes it is impossible to get something, no matter how hard you try. When he heard the advice to absorb knowledge like a sponge, he was dissatisfied. His classmate literally meant that he had a holy head. Taking a multiple-choice test is actually not difficult. However, you should strain a little and learn the basics. For Jim, who had tasted life, the angry friend seemed cute. He tried to calm him down, but words were of little help. The main character was sure that his friend had other strengths. He should enter the university during the additional recruitment. Ethan's family has always helped those in need. Their main rule is to give more than you get, so even the youngest worked as volunteers once a week. A friend advised me to continue volunteering because this will help me enter a good university in the future. However, these were the words of Ethan himself. In the past, he told a friend about it when he got very drunk after not entering. Working as a volunteer alone is difficult. You need to gain experience. And this is not as easy as it seems. You had to come up with something. Just at this time, the headman, together with his comrades, was discussing the place of the president of the student council. Elections would be held soon. Austin was confident of his victory, as his parents promised to pay the expenses spent on the election campaign. This approach was wrong. A brilliant idea came to the mind of our hero. Ethan should become the president of their school student council. My friend did not even consider such an approach. Although it could help him with admission, it seemed unrealistic. In Jim's eyes, Austin was just as manipulative and impudent as his former boss. It was impossible to allow him to win the election. Resigned to his fate and considering all options, Ethan did not hesitate for long and decided to fully trust his comrade. They shook hands. The main character knew that the further fate of a classmate could depend on this decision. The chance should not be missed. In the same week, the headman was taking his first steps. In his, as it seemed to him, already close victory, There were students at the entrance to the school, loudly agitating those entering. The noise annoyed even Jim. Many were given candy on Austin's behalf. It was a great step to attract attention. Ethan was holding one of the bags of treats. The mood for studying disappeared abruptly. The actions of the headman could add to his voices. He asked if they should do something like this. If so, when, as time went on, and with it the opportunity to get like-minded people. But the friend had a plan. They don't need to spend much such activity. On the contrary, gets boring for many, and there is no point in repeating after the enemy. At the end of the week, it was decided to hang leaflets in the toilets. The guys counted the required number, and by Saturday, everything was ready. Such a move was the right one. The students would see the posters. Even if they did not want to, the tactics were on their side. The posters were simple and eye-catching, some of which said that Ethan would make it to the student council even if he wasn't studying. From the past, Jim knew that the audience reacts perfectly to simple and repeated influence. You need something understandable and bright. Many students were unhappy with the noise that arose because of the upcoming elections. Austin clearly went too far with campaigning. Everyone knew that he was the best student in school, but this did not save him. The opinion of teenagers was getting worse every day. At the same time, there was talk of a second candidate named Ethan. As our hero had planned, everyone saw the posters. Cheerful images and flashy inscriptions had their effect. Simplicity and a non-standard approach attracted attention. Friends did not campaign, saying that they did not want to disturb their elders. Some laughed at Ethan, while others supported him. The noise from Austin's assistants increasingly inclined the students to choose another candidate. The students talked more and more about other participants in the elections. Many were of the opinion that an idiot would choose an idiot because Ethan wrote that he did not study. This significantly bribed school children. A similar change in the mood of the students was noticed by the headman. He did not like the option of his possible loss. The day of the election of the president of the student council came. All the students lined up in front of the stands and listened to the introduction of the school principal. The next was the headman. He prepared a long speech aimed at attracting the attention of the students, but it turned out the other way around. Many people began to get bored after 5 minutes. Some yawned, others talked about their own. The main character began to anticipate the imminent victory of his friend. I wondered how many people would listen to this lengthy speech, filled with promises and assurances of imminent change. Next, Ethan was supposed to speak to the students, passing by the headman. He was very worried, but tried not to show it. He began with a loud performance to attract the attention of tired school children. He talked about his aspirations. His desire was to take this position not for his personal goals, but only to come to honesty and correctness, to change school life, to make it more comfortable. He had good diction, a correct text, the essence of which was to promulgate his advantage over the rest. Although Ethan was not the best student, he could devote himself to studying. Jim was pleased with his friend's performance. The sight was truly remarkable, and the school children could see how they were animated. At the bow at the end of the speech, Ethan was applauded by many students. His words touched their hearts and gave hope for a better future. Although he did not receive a standing ovation, he was expected to win according to the results of the vote. He was elected by almost 100 more people than Austin. The president of the student council was elected, and with him his deputy, who became the headman. This alignment did not suit everyone. The dissatisfied face of the opponent could not be hidden. On the same day, between lessons, the headman and his henchmen decided to talk to Ethan to discuss further actions. They needed to discuss the members of the student council. The prefect wanted to appoint the people in charge of clubs and planning himself. Ethan only had to choose those who were responsible for studying, sports, and communications. Austin did not even give his classmate a choice. The main character intervened in the conversation. He knew that the choice of the main persons is the prerogative of the new president, and the vice president has no right to interfere. The deputy decided to besiege the student who intervened in the conversation, thinking that he had no influence and no relation to the affairs of the organization. Jim reminded Austin of his words during the speech. He promised to treat everyone with respect, but now insults those he does not like. The classroom was filled with the shouts of the vice president. The schoolboy chased away a classmate, advising the scoundrel to shut up. Ethan interrupted the unnecessary arguments. His friend had the authority to shut the mouth of someone who was part of the system. These words made the screamer take aback. He did not understand what position the main character sitting in front of him occupies. Jim was surprised when he heard that he was being appointed head of the planning department. This had not been discussed beforehand. Now Ethan acted on his own. The insults continued. The headman thought his boss was crazy. No one would put Jim in this position. However, the new president could not be persuaded. He intends to choose the remaining people himself, thereby warning not to interfere. The students sitting in the classroom laughed at the hot-tempered headman. He should have been put in his place a long time ago. He takes on too much. Disgraced, Austin pushed his comrades away and ran away from the office. Everything was always easy for him. What could go wrong? He blamed it all on Jim, who had set his friend up for president and interfered with plans that were going so well. Foolish Ethan had changed only because of him. It was all because of him. The headman would never forget it. A plan for revenge was already brewing in his head. After school, the two friends calmly went home. Jim did not understand why he was appointed head of the planning department, because his friend had been warned about the hero's intention to study. The friend knew this, but in this rotten system, he needed a confidant. He asked a friend to help a little. Since it was Jim who dragged his friend into this, he had to agree. Then a tall man approached them from behind. Hearing that they were called out, the guys turned around in unison. Mason was standing in front of them. None of his comrades expected his appearance. Mason was simply huge, the tallest student in the school, in addition to having considerable muscles, swarthy with sharp features. The main character recognized him. The one who approached them was the best fighter in the school. They studied in the same class in high school. Despite his stern appearance, the schoolboy was the only one to express his condolences after the death of Uncle Jim. Now the mood of the thug was negative. Calling his former classmate a puppy, he began to accuse the main character of reckless behavior. The guy was serious about the fight. Bad behavior was often noticed behind him. Jim expressed his doubts about the outcome of their brawl. The fighter swung first, his advantages in strength and skills. More than once the victory was for him. Everyone knew that there was no one stronger than Mason. The main character managed to dodge in time. It was not difficult to calculate the movements of such a car, given the weight. The enemy was too slow and clumsy. Even taking into account the complexion, Jim served in the special forces in a previous life. The body remembered long training and techniques that had to be memorized for a long time. An accurate blow fell on the solar plexus area. The opponent took his breath away. Instinctively, his hands leaned against his chest. The next kick hit him in the head. Jim was forcibly dragged into the army, and the only thing he got out of there was endurance and fortitude, thanks to which he did not get drunk and became the god of golf. A defeated disciple would fall to the ground. One couldn't expect such abilities from a guy with a fragile physique who hadn't even fought. Our protagonist expressed empathy for the defeated. His friend could not even put two words together. He was so surprised by the scene he saw. Yes, Mason did not see anything and could not condemn our heroes. But this did not prevent him from getting into a fight and insulting two classmates. Jim did not want to contact his attacker unnecessarily, but if such attacks did not stop, it could not be avoided. The guys suspected that Mason grappled with them for a reason. There was some good reason behind it, since nothing connected them. On the way home, the comrades began to discuss it. It was necessary to find out the purpose of the attack, and as soon as possible, it was necessary to prevent a repetition of the incident. But Ethan digressed from the topic, trying to find out if his friend had secretly attended karate classes. He did not understand the difference in techniques and martial arts. After the next day, our hero decided to act. He had suspicions about who could be behind yesterday's event. He understood that it was forbidden to look through other people's personal files. But still, he also got it. Probably, it can be considered that they are even. Jim found Austin's case. All that remained was to find the dossier on Mason. Probably the two were somehow related. All that remained was to find a clue. The thug was left without parents at an early age. Of his relatives, he has only a younger sister. He has a special position, so he receives help from the state. The schoolboy remembered how he saw a classmate waiting for a bus, which was strange because he lived very close to the school. Mason had a jacket with the name of a company on it that day, and Jim always had a good memory. Before school the next day, the weather was beautiful. The sun was shining brightly and it was warm enough. Nature was beautiful. But our hero was too busy looking for information about the company where their recent offender worked. The firm was called Han Industries. and its owner was none other than Austin's father, a big businessman with too much money. In the head of the main character, a brilliant plan arose on how to set such a strong person on their side. It remains to push Ethan to do the right thing. He offered to put Mason in the role of head of the department responsible for sports, attracting the interest of his friend in such an unexpected decision. Jim's face was almost lit up with anticipation. Although it frightened the new president of the student council, he could not refuse him. The frightened teenager stood in the office. Thoughts flashed through his head about all the possible outcomes of his conversation with the offender, but the conversation could not be avoided. The schoolboy clearly did not expect to see the president so soon after their meeting. It was worth listening to someone who dared to distract him from his favorite comic. An offer from a shaking classmate to take a vacant position in charge of sports did not seem attractive. The thug decided to play a joke on Ethan, pretending to be happy, exclaimed loudly he had long dreamed of this, but could not decide on such a responsible matter. The schoolboy did not immediately realize that he was being played, but soon the truth was revealed, and the joyful face was replaced by surprise. The haughty scoundrel was about to beat him up again, and for the impudence shown in his direction, the threats became more and more dangerous. Already next to his comrade, the boy, frightened to death, became bolder. His depiction of the recent scene looked very plausible. He accused Jim of recklessness. He clearly sent him to certain death. It was good that the schoolboy ran fast and was able to run away from danger. Assurances of the need for such an act did not help to convince Ethan. He did not understand whether his friend really wanted him dead or was ready to die himself. Our hero gave the example of the proverb that he who is forewarned is forearmed, because according to his plan, very soon Mason will take the right position. You just need to write his name. Very soon the first meeting of the renewed student council was scheduled. Almost everyone came, but as expected, Mason was not there. Only his chair was empty in the small office. It seemed that only Jim had noticed. The discussion was in full swing. The distribution of the scholarship allocated to the members of the student council was on the agenda. Our hero proposed to give it to the person in charge of sports. These words embarrassed Austin. He thought that Mason had beaten his enemy, but he was not stupid enough to voluntarily give money to the offender. Rough facts were used. It was worth arguing your act, a story about the financial condition of a colleague in forced work. I should set the student council in the right mood. The narration from this side will force everyone to agree, since it will simply be ugly to refuse. And knowing about the character of the thug, no one wanted to cross his path. After the end of the meeting, the two friends had a quiet lunch in the classroom. The school food was not very sophisticated, although it was not bad. Their meal and peaceful conversation were interrupted by the guttural cries of the recently discussed fighter. It was clear what he wanted. Despite the good intentions on the part of the heads of the student council, the student was too aggressive and did not look friendly at all. He grabbed the indignant Ethan by the collar of his school vest, clearly intending to start a scuffle, completely ignoring the others. The main complaint was a lack of understanding why he would receive a scholarship for nothing, because he had recently refused a vacancy. Jim calmly explained to a classmate that it was his proposal. It was he who insisted on it during the council meeting. The mood of the athlete changed. He behaved more carefully with our hero after the recent incident, although he clearly informed that gratitude should not be expected. Jim's sympathy caused even greater aggression. No one is allowed to feel sorry for Mason. He has not experienced such humiliation for a long time. The cunning hero easily ignored his attacks, explaining that the dissatisfaction could be settled with a refund. But then the athlete's sister would suffer. The thug wondered how his opponent could know about his deplorable condition. He carefully tried to hide any information about his relatives and finances. After the death of her parents, she barely had time to grow up. She worked part-time to help her brother provide for their life, but at the same time, she did not have time to study. Mason, like any older brother, did not want this for his sister, dreaming of her a successful career and a good marriage, which cannot be expected in the current situation. Pride should not be allowed to prevail over reason. Because of this, an innocent person whose life has not yet had time to take shape. Mason realized the situation. It was his brotherly duty to protect his sister from everything bad. He could not think only of himself. If he becomes the head of the sports department, his conscience will be clear to the members of the student council and to those who have a much harder time. Everyone was already present at the second meeting of the council. The bulky figure of the athlete stood out from the rest of his colleagues. Austin was clearly uncomfortable to be around. Ethan, as the president of the council, decided to diffuse the situation, although it looked a little funny and inappropriate. All the students were surprised by such a trick. None of them could afford this. Everyone was afraid of the lively schoolboy. There was an even more awkward silence, everyone waiting for Mason's answer. Only the clock on the wall continued to tick in its usual rhythm. During a brief greeting, the fighter looked more or less relaxed, showing his readiness to continue the dialogue that had arisen. Even Jim did not expect this from his comrade. Just yesterday, these two were ready to fight among themselves. The atmosphere became less tense, and soon everyone moved on to discussing everyday topics. And there were many of them. The scientific club did not have enough finances. Jim rejected Austin's request. This club had already requested support for the purchase of research equipment. Their request was approved. The refusal infuriated the headman. He was friends with the head of the scientific club and could not let him down in any way. He took this behavior personally. He was quickly besieged. If he wanted to do things his own way, he should have thought about it earlier and still head the student council. Austin considered our hero a stupid man who did not understand anything and only interfered in his affairs, trying to put spokes in his wheels. The impudent man turned to Mason, expecting support from someone whom he could seemingly influence with the help of his father. But even here I did not meet the necessary. A stern look and advice to shut up looked more like an order that could not be disobeyed. Such a confident in his abilities, the headman was quickly brought down from heaven to earth. He did not imagine anything on his own, and somewhere inside he understood it. So he was very frightened of his former like-minded person. Mason was no longer dependent on him, as he had quit his father's factory and taken a job at another firm where he earned less, but he was much freer. Aware of the loss of support, Austin sat silently throughout the meeting, pondering possible next steps. Left alone with Jim, the athlete sincerely thanked him for his help, because our hero applied to the aid fund on his behalf. Thanks to his actions, the financial affairs of the fighter's family were improving. His sister could devote all her time to studying and improving her knowledge. But Jim had nothing to thank for. He did it not for the sake of Mason or himself. The path of fights and brawls is not the one worth choosing. Even if the circumstances forced him, any person has a choice, making which he must be responsible for the consequences that arise. Despite everything that has been done, after his apology, everyone will soon forget the pugnacious Mason. A renewed man will appear before them. Leaving the office, the main character realized that his words hurt the student. Perhaps in the near future, he will change a lot. After the days filled with study and stress, the summer holidays awaited the school children. Ethan's joy knew no bounds. But his friend was going to study even now. This was not part of the plans of the cheerful comrade. He wanted to devote the last day of school to rest in computer games. Jim assumed that his comrade missed losing. In response, he heard a grin and a popular youth word, LOL. How could he forget about it? Going back in time, he completely forgot that he was a teenager and had to correspond to his age. Each in their thoughts, the children were heading towards the exit from school. The last school day was over. They should have a little rest. The main character was called out by Mason, who approached. Even without his sports uniform, he looked threatening. The new friend had a request that could not be postponed. The athlete wanted to improve his knowledge, and this required Jim's help. Such rapid voluntary changes were amazing, but this stern thug decided that it was worth deciding on plans for the future, and for now he did not know what he was interested in besides sports. Our hero had no choice but to agree. He liked the mood of his classmate. Hearing the consent, the athlete was very happy. Helping a friend was also beneficial to Jim. In his past life, he had sunk to the bottom only because he did not have close people who were ready to support him at any moment. It is impossible to survive in society without three things: connections, education, and friends. His former boss started from the same position, but was able to climb the career ladder. Our hero was always alone. Only he worked and did not care about his environment, did not give anything to people, and accordingly did not receive anything. At some point, there is no one left next to him at all. An ungrateful man eradicates all people around him. And one day, looking back, Jim realized his loneliness, but it was too late. A monster appeared that was resistant to such people, and he devoured him completely. And now in this life, he gladly agreed to help with Mason's irresistible desire to learn. He clearly understood that the guy would be the first precious thread connecting him with society in the future. Altogether, the guys wandered along the street of the city, discussing further plans regarding the schedule of study during the holidays. Ethan asked the guys not to think about studying, at least today, on the first day of vacation, but to enjoy the moment, because there was a day of games at the stadium. Our main character reminded his friend that after the holidays, he would have to become a high school student and decide on his future path. But Ethan, covering his ears with his hands, did not want to listen to this. Hearing the conversation of his friends, the bully Mason suddenly broke out in sweat, frightened by his own uncertainty in later life. Trying not to show his excitement, he calmly told the guys that he had to rush to the toilet, saying that he would catch up with them. In fact, he ran there as fast as he could. He was overwhelmed by a feeling of fear uncharacteristic of a fearless athlete. Seeing Mason off with their eyes, the guys stood in front of the doors of the mall, pondering his strange behavior. Suddenly behind them, they heard an unpleasant speech and, turning around, saw an impudent man who was shaking a boy by the shoulder, a head shorter than him. Jim and Ethan stared at what was happening, realizing that the offender was insistently demanding something, using obscene language. Feeling their superiority and enlisting the support of their comrade in arms, the guys knocked out money, driving their victim into a corner. The victim was a guy from a nearby school, seemingly kind and shy, and also a nerd who was not able to stand up for himself. Our protagonist suggested to his friend not to interfere at first, but to observe how the conflict would end, because this was not the first time this had happened. Jim was well aware that with his taekwondo skills, everything could be settled right now. But the further prospect of a victim was not rosy. The offender's name was Tom. Interested in the observers from the outside, he distracted himself from the nerd for a moment and looked at them intently. When Tom asked why they hatched, the guys pretended that they did not understand what was going on and calmly continued to stand. Tom did not expect such a mockery and yelled with threats that he was addressing them, and before it was too late, he offered to get out of here or they would regret it. Not in the least frightened, Jim grinned, amused at the offender and his life, which had forced him to take money from the weak. Calling the main character a piece of shit, the enraged, impudent man turned around and rushed towards him, shouting nasty things. The guy is a nerd. He breathed a sigh of relief, but the thought ran through his head that the conflict would not end so easily. He stood without moving, while the offenders, clenching their hands in fists, prepared to attack the guys. Determined to prevent a conflict with a word, not a fight, Ethan tried to stop the villains and explain that this idea could end badly for them. These words angered Tom even more. Perceiving his deplorable ending as a threat, he deliberately continued provocations. Ethan persistently continued to hint that Jim had the skills to fight, and his friend's agility clearly prevailed over strength. Seeing the uselessness of dialogue, our hero confirmed aloud about his capabilities, saying that his friend was right and that he was actually a specialist in Taekwondo techniques. Jim's assurances could not convince the two attackers, who looked at each other in silence, very doubtful about the veracity of what they had said. They took everything as an amusing joke, and after a moment's pause, holding onto their stomachs, they died of laughter. Having laughed to his heart's content, Tom warned that he should not be divorced and once again called the guys bastards. Then Jim could not stand it. Taking a wrestling stance, he offered to attack. He had no intention of escaping. Taking everything as a bluff, Tom aimed at the face and swung his fist, but the nimble taekwondo player avoided the blow, ducking in time. Slipping out from under the opponent's fist, the guy immediately applied a technique, and the blow of his right hand fell exactly on the head. Jim considered it necessary to once again try to convince him of the truthfulness of his words, and the intention to prevent the conflict peacefully. Anger and revenge were approaching the impudent man, not wanting to listen to anything. He bit his lip and was about to continue fighting. Chaotically waving his arms, Tom never hit Jim. With light movements of his body, the guy managed to avoid hitting. Rejoicing at the outcome of the duel, Ethan stood at a distance and supported his friend, admiring his skill. Meanwhile, Mason returned from the toilet. Seeing the guys fighting, he approached them to find out what was going on here. The guy put himself in order and was in great shape. As usual, he looked at the situation menacingly and calmly from the outside. He knew almost everyone who started fights and brawls in the neighborhood and, of course, recognized Tom when he came close to him. Then he put his heavy hand on the shoulder of the impudent man, after which he shook himself and called Mason by name in a trembling voice. The thug did not like his willful behavior and extortion of money, and he squeezed Tom's shoulder with all his strength, hurting him. Squeezing harder, he did not let go of the boy's shoulder until he apologized, writhing in pain. Only after receiving an apology, Mayman let the extortionist go, warning him never to be seen again. The offenders quickly fled from their scene of the crime. They did not even look back, fearing persecution. Previously, Mason often took part in local showdowns, and he himself was not averse to fighting once again. So his good deed made Jim very happy. The scuffle ended well, the extortionist fled, and in this turmoil, everyone forgot about the botany schoolboy. The guy, still recovering from the stress, stuttering slightly, thanked the guys for their help. Ethan suggested that the nerd punish the offenders and tell about everything that happened at school or contact the police so that this does not happen again. But the boy preferred to just change the school. He told the guys about the impending move of his family to another area of the city. He thanked him once again for saving him from the extortionists and asked if he could find out the names of those who were not afraid to stand up for him. Jim happily introduced himself and introduced Mason, the thug, pointing at him. Ethan stood thoughtful and dissatisfied with himself. Alone, he did nothing to save the guy, just stood and watched on the sidelines. Looking into the eyes of the smiling children, the boy promised never to forget their kindness and help. After saying goodbye, they wished each other good luck and went about their business. The botanist stood for a short time, seeing off his saviors, and left with the hope of seeing each other again. The boys were leaving when Jim remembered that they hadn't asked the boy's name and turned around and told his friends. He looked hopefully into the distance but saw no one. By that time, the boy had already left and the street was empty. Thinking that perhaps they would meet again someday, the friends continued their way towards knowledge. Life went on as usual, and a black executive car parked on the next street. A driver in the same black suit was waiting nearby. A young gentleman approached the car, and the driver greeted him, bowed, clarifying whether everything was in order. Remembering the names of the defenders, the young man got into the car. He turned out to be the same nerd whom the guys had just saved from robbers. While the black car was taking the little master away, the friends came to John's house. They were very eager to do their homework. The door was opened by the mother of the main character. She did not know Mason and was confused when she saw such a tall bully among her son's friends. Mason politely introduced himself to his mother and told her that it was a very happy acquaintance for him. Jumping over his classmate's shoulder, Ethan also hurried to greet Jim's mother, who had known him since he was a baby. Chatting merrily, they struck up a casual conversation about the relationship between guys and girls and about spending time together. From his past life, Jim remembered perfectly well that Ethan was still a braggart. He grinned while his friend told about his fictional adventures. Until now, his friend's heart had not been occupied by anyone, and he boasted that he would soon find the perfect girlfriend for himself. Evening came. It was quite dark outside, and Jim, seeing his classmates home, wished them to be careful. All his family members, having settled down comfortably, were watching an intellectual television game. When Jim entered the room, his mother asked her son if he had seen his friends off. She realized that it was dark and unsafe outside. Yawning, the guy replied to his mother that everything was fine and the guys safely got home. The time was late, but the main character was not going to go to bed. He told his parents that he would study a little more and went to his room. Jim's older sister's name was Chloe. Hearing about her brother's zeal to study, she looked up from the TV and laughed after him. Her mother, outraged by her daughter's indifference and indifference to the life of her brother, slapped her, calling her a vile girl. While her mother was raising Chloe, her father entered into a family showdown. He supported his son's zeal for study and wished him good luck. Hearing the words of support from the dearest person, Jim promised to work hard and try even harder. A hot summer passed, followed by a fierce winter, and the long-awaited new school year came. Jim came to school with pleasure, especially since today he has become a real high school student. The classmates missed the time of absence and frolicked in the office, running from desk to desk, and Jim enjoyed the school atmosphere. Mason, who had arrived early and was already sitting in his seat, when the classmates saw each other, they greeted each other happily. From this year, the children were enrolled in the same class. Offering to try together, they stretched out their hands to each other, symbolizing friendliness. Suddenly, someone's third hand interrupted the unfinished gesture of the guys, blocking the way between them. This hand belonged to Ethan. He came to class a little later and reacted jealously to the friendly handshake of his friends. A loud slam of the front door was heard, and the children saw the formidable figure of the class teacher. Rocking his accustomed weapon in his hands, he ordered everyone to be silent, and an ominous silence fell in the office. The teacher had not changed at all, as he had been before, and he had not parted with his bat for the third year in a row. This is how you can briefly describe that distant school year, lived by Jim for the second time in his life. The cold began, and with their onset, the students graduated from high school, and to the festive beat of drums, noisy graduations were held. Each parent worried and prayed for his child. The whole future life of the child depended on the entrance exam. That day, the streets were full of young people, and police cars drove back and forth with sirens, watching the order. Jim had to take the entrance exam again, this time for the second time in his life, and he was as nervous as the first. Not all the children, yesterday's school children, could afford to get to the exam. Many simply created support groups, wishing good luck to applicants. On the way to knowledge and success, one of the guys offered Jim to drink delicious tea, which had a calming effect. After a glass of tea, the world around seemed not so gloomy, and my soul became brighter and happier. Many children went to the exam immersed in their thoughts. They were frightened by the uncertainty of the future exam, and therefore their position in society. Jim remembered how in his past life, he, just like the rest of us today, merged with this mass of children dejected by the unknown. Hearing the wishes of good luck, success, and good fortune, Jim, confident in his abilities, crossed the threshold of the university. After a while, our protagonist was clinking filled glasses in a crowded bar, clinking glasses with his friends. Drinking alcohol glass after glass, former classmates gathered to celebrate their achievements and share their impressions of the exam they experienced. They were preparing for an important moment in life and had not met together for a long time, and today there was a significant reason. Jim easily entered the university. He congratulated Ethan, who passed in the additional intake, and now they had to study together. Mason also entered the sports department of another university, but he didn't seem to be very happy about it. Friends shared plans and fantasized about the future when Mason announced that he would take the entrance exams again. Why go through such trials again was clear only to the thug himself. He was not joking at all. As he began to talk about his plans, he told a story about his desire to study with his friends at the same faculty. At the same time, with surprise and admiration, former classmates stared at Mason, their mouths open at the unexpected statement. Jim was pleased with this decision of his friend and promised to help deal with the difficulties, raising a glass for great news. The guys could not stop, and the evening dragged on, drinking glass after glass. They were happy about the new life ahead. Mason could no longer leave the bar on his own feet. While Jim caught a taxi, Ethan offered his shoulder to his friend, firmly supporting him. The friends sat their heavy burden in the backseat of the car and said goodbye until the next meeting. Jim watched the taxi leave as he muttered to himself how much his shoulder was numb. The evening turned out to be a success, and the former classmates did not want to part at all. Then Jim offered to return to the bar and drink one more. Fleetingly, the guy was confronted by his work in the office in his past life and his daily drinking in the billiard club. The body tempered by alcohol felt great in this life, and the boys began to fool around right on the roadway. After embracing together, they returned to their place of pleasure to continue drinking and having fun until late at night. Ethan woke up closer to lunchtime the next day and immediately decided to call a friend and ask him how he was feeling. As it turned out, Jim was woken up by an earlier call from the university. The Department of Management had moved to another city, and he had to get ready for the road. Hearing such news, Ethan was, of course, worried. His Department of Literature remained in the same place, which meant that they would have to study from a distance. Without stopping the dialogue with his former classmate, Jim sat down at the computer to download the files necessary for studying at the university. But he no longer heard what his friend was talking about. A message appeared on the monitor screen that greatly excited the guy. The day came to arrive at the university, and the main character in the stream of the same first-year students was in a hurry not to be late. He walked down the street of the city, dreaming of new acquaintances, and perhaps new friends for life, or at least 4 years of study. Most of all, Jim was afraid of making a mistake in people, having unpleasant memories of communicating with a person from a past life. In the parking lot of the university, several buses were waiting for students to board, each departing according to its destination. An adult man was loudly calling to first-year students of the Department of Management on one of the buses, and Jim came to board. When he got on the bus, there were only a few empty seats, and many students, having got to know each other, chatted merrily. The main character, slowly walking between the rows in search of a place near the window, but not finding a free one, decided to sit down by the aisle. Putting his belongings under the seat, Jim happily greeted the thin boy with glasses sitting next to him. The guy introduced himself as Oliver and said that he entered the first year of university, in fact, like our main character. Jim also hurried to give his name and told the story of his long journey along the path of knowledge that led him to this bus. The name of the guy seemed very familiar to Oliver. He looked intently at his neighbor and recalled the circumstances of the meeting. A series of buses took the children to a new student life without parental care and friends who remained in another city. The road was not close. During the trip, Oliver said that he was the only child in the family and he did not have a brother or sister. The main character could not even imagine how to be alone in the family. Living together with his older sister left a certain imprint. While the other guys on the bus slept, Jim quietly talked about the unbearable life with his flighty sister. For the only child in the family, the absence of a brother or sister means loneliness of communication, because the parents are busy with their own affairs. Oliver was really lonely because of his chronic cough. He didn't play football with the guys and didn't go to the computer club. Jim promised that at the university they would definitely make friends and spend all their free time together. The words sowed doubts in the guy's head. A person in society always wanted to be friends with strong and confident people and chose them. I remember he was always offended, extorted money, and it was easier to give everything to the offenders than to get beaten and end up in a hospital bed. Jim was very confident in the conversation, and Oliver recognized him as one of the guys who had saved him from the robbers. In fact, the main character was not very convinced that good and decent friends would immediately be found at the university. Glancing at the kind and naive guy sitting by the window, Jim said that he definitely already had one friend. Oliver, constantly experiencing the experience of not communicating, for the first time in his life acquired a real friend. Not noticing the road, the guys arrived at the place. Their escort invited all students to break into groups of several people. Looking out for their supervisor, a senior student from the crowd, the friends definitely decided to be in the same group and stick together. The curator shouted the names of the first-year students loudly and clearly, and it was not difficult to find him. Suddenly, Jim's expression changed. He saw his supervisor, a senior, and studied his personality closely. He looked at the protruding ears, the protruding chin, the thin eyebrows, and the close-set eyes that he had clearly met somewhere. Oliver, for some reason, bowed to the curator as a sign of greeting, but Jim did not appreciate his friend's act and simply gave his names. The curator called himself Michael and looked arrogantly at the guys, warning that he was not a nanny and was not going to show care. Every negative situation in life is always stored in the memory of a person, and our hero is no exception. The past life ran before Jim's eyes. The very deputy, the culprit of the humiliation and his death, was opposite. Without suspecting anything, the curator smiled and stretched out his hand to the guys as a sign of pleasant acquaintance. The meeting with the past alerted the main character, but as if nothing had happened, he shook hands with his worst enemy. All these gestures and smiles were just a mask that Michael had easily used in the boy's past life. Jim did not let go of the curator's hand. His mind was stirred by past memories, which made him squeeze it harder and harder. Screaming in pain, Michael pulled his hand away and wanted to pounce on the offender, who had figured out to smooth out the conflict in time. After the acquaintance, the curator, still rubbing his hand, angrily sent the guys to the group to rest and go to sleep. The friends did not have to sleep. Michael decided to celebrate the arrival of the newcomers and, taking a bottle of alcohol, burst into the group to the students. The room was unfurnished, and a company of 8 boys and 1 girl sat on the floor, forming a kind of round table. The curator poured alcohol into paper cups for the children and deliberately filled them to the very edge. Jim immediately noticed that Michael had chosen the weakest and aimed to get Oliver drunk by arranging a so-called survival test. He ordered the guy to drink to the bottom and watched him closely with a demonic gaze. The main character knew the manners of this evil man very well. He tested them daily and did not wish this to anyone. Oliver's carelessness was frightening. He followed any instructions of the senior, and Jim worried about his inexperienced friend. The boy drank glass after glass to the bottom, eating chips and nuts. With his efforts, he wanted to gain authority among his elders. Everyone present saw perfectly well that the level of health danger had reached the limit, But Michael deliberately continued to mock the guy. Oliver felt nauseous, but no one cared about the boy's condition. No one dared to stop the farce. Inner anger rolled over Jim as it turned out the bastard, on the contrary, had a vile character since his time at the university. His ruthless behavior, lack of compassion, cruelty, and alienation from the feelings of others caused fear. Cornered, Oliver gave in to the pressure of the senior and raised the glass to his lips with trembling hands. After drinking the hot liquid, the boy coughed very hard, provoking an attack of a chronic disease. Having got used to the role, Michael enjoyed a perverted performance, the director of which was himself. Having seen enough of the performance, Jim decided to play according to a different scenario and get the main role. He deliberately snatched the glass from his friend's hands, thereby saving him from a hopeless situation. Now the role of the director was in the hands of a first-year student, and he immediately seized the initiative in his own hands, offering to pour a drink to the curator. Michael approved the offer of a drink on the condition that Jim would drink on an equal footing with him. The guy drank his share of alcohol, and now they competed with each other, making a kind of bet. Drinking with the deputy in a past life, the freshman was well aware of the abilities and consequences of drinking alcohol. Ruthlessly crumpling and throwing out the glass he had drunk, Michael lost control of himself. He grabbed a box with the remaining bottles and suggested that we drink straight from them rather than use measuring cups. It seemed that the artillery was used, and the first bottle drunk in one gulp was instantly empty. Michael's hands trembled with rage, and he smashed the empty bottle on the edge of the box, shards of which sparkled everywhere on the floor. Frightened by the consequences, the guys, having witnessed such actions, offered to go to their rooms. Then the enraged curator grabbed a shard of glass and squeezed it tightly in his hand, so that drops of blood splashed. It was Jim's turn to drink a bottle of liquor, and in front of the amazed audience, he easily fulfilled the terms of the deal. He smashed his empty bottle on the edge of the crate in the same way, passing the baton to his opponent. This continued over and over again. After each bottle drunk, it shattered into sharp fragments in the hands of the guys. The fun was taking a new turn and was not at all like the pranks of young people who were schoolchildren yesterday. You can pacify a person who has poor emotional control by avoiding provocations and staying calm. After another bottle he drank, Michael stopped thinking and controlling his coordination. Leaning over to him, Jim asked if everything was all right, and when he heard a grunt in response, he was convinced that the guy had just gone too far. Taking advantage of the moment, he bent over his ear and whispered one important phrase that only he himself understood. Overwhelmed by the alcohol, Michael collapsed to the floor and froze in an unconscious position. His classmates tried to bring their friend to consciousness, unsuccessfully pulling on all parts of the body. Assessing the outcome of the event, a young girl, Elsa, approved the act of a handsome newcomer. The play was over, everyone went to their rooms, and Jim hurried outside under the nearest tree, unable to stand the amount of drinking. After clearing his stomach, he shared the sound of joy with the world, releasing pent-up emotions and celebrating his first victory over Michael. Feeling relieved, the main character collapsed on the grass and looked into the dark distance until the morning of the next day came. From the very morning, Michael sought salvation in the public toilet of the university, freeing his body from yesterday's alcoholic toxins. Remembering the evening on the verge of consciousness and sudden unconsciousness, his head was splitting into pieces. He tried to recall in his memory fragments of the last words he had heard before the fall and disappeared from his memory. Michael's appearance was pitiful. He was sitting on the floor near the toilet bowl, and a classmate caught him doing this simple thing. Kim's boyfriend was a witness to yesterday's argument. He came to save his still drunk friend and help bring him back to consciousness. Discussing the party, Michael blamed Jim for his current state. He was not at all embarrassed by the amount of alcohol he drank. Kim, knowing the character of his friend, understood the futility of the conversation, but still tried to convince him of the opposite and forget about the stupid argument. As a result, the memory of his defeat only developed anger and caused a desire for revenge, exceeding common sense. Trying to pacify the hunger for revenge, Kim offered to bring something to eat, worried about the health of the senior student. Hearing in response the intention to invite Jim to the local club and take revenge, the guy looked anxiously at the man in the toilet stall. His vengeance, sharp as a knife blade, pierced his soul and became a shadow sliding across the walls, and his eyes cold as ice. How Jim received an invitation to the club, we will find out later, But in the meantime, he and his friend Oliver walked around the shops of the shopping center. He admired himself in front of the mirror and straightened his hair on his head, trying on a very beautiful and expensive cloak. The cloak really fit very well, and Oliver hastened to evaluate his friend's worthy choice and agreed to pay for the purchase. However, the clothes in this store were very expensive, and the first-year student was clearly unaffordable, unless he was from a rich family. Oliver's act was far from unreasonable. He remembered his friend's good deeds and was in a hurry to please him with at least such a trifle. After expressing his gratitude, Jim promised to get a part-time job and pay back the debt every month. And here's the day when the seniors invited the guys to join their startup club called Epikleon. The offer was very unexpected for friends, and the name of the club, translated from Greek, sounded like a victory song and was very impressive. Elsa and Kim told about the rich history of Epikleon and the graduates who have already become successful and even started their own business. Jim suggested that the opportunity to join the club would eventually allow him to join the board of directors of a large company. Without hesitation, the guy agreed, especially since there had been no proposals from another university club yet. The pleased first-year student immediately invited Oliver, who was connected to him by an invisible thread of friendship, to join Epikleon. In fact, Elsa got ahead of the handsome man, being the first to invite a rich freshman to a hobby club. Oliver, for some reason, did not share the news with his friend and looked inquiringly into the eyes of his classmate, looking for an answer in them. Life went on as usual. Jim, putting on a new raincoat, wandered in a stream of students like himself and caught the admiring glances of the girls. Not paying attention to the world around him, the guy suddenly stopped. Someone's familiar silhouette burned into his memory and made him come to his senses. Recognizing his childhood friend Ethan, he turned around abruptly and called out to the guy who was not going to stop. The classmate did not recognize the elegantly dressed young man as his friend, with whom he had been friends for many years. For a moment, Ethan's eyes widened and his thoughts, like a bolt from the blue, became entangled in a whirlwind of surging feelings. He did not recognize his old friend at all. In this new raincoat, he had changed a lot and looked like a student of a theater university. Taking the words of his former classmate as a compliment, Jim asked if his friend had picked up a club of interest for himself. Communities of people united by common hobbies and goals did not interest Ethan very much. He had enough literature at the university. But Jim brought the young man to Epikleon, not a literary club at all, and all so that the friends could see each other more often. In the office, the seniors were interviewing new members. Jim introduced Ethan and lied that he was very interested in business. While the guys lied about their business hobbies, sweat rolled down the literary critic's face. His body was tensely coping with stress. The commission consisted of 2 students, Michael and Kim, the first of whom looked at the candidates with an unfriendly look. The guys talked about themselves and their strengths, boldly answering any question asked. Kim liked the guys' craving for new ideas, experience, and knowledge, and unlike Michael, he was happy to be replenished in the ranks of his comrades in arms. Jima was alert when he saw the hostile attitude of another member of the commission and hurried to get ahead of him by interfering in the dialogue. Before he could open his mouth, Michael listened in confusion to the student's endless speech, unable to insert a word. Jim showed cunning, bowing. He expressed words of gratitude for the trust placed in him and for his personal invitation to Epikleon. Such speeches filled Michael's ears with sweet honey, and enjoying the words, he advised the freshman to work hard. Today, Jim really played the role of a theater-goer, playing a scene of trust he will later eviscerate and twist the enemy into minced meat. According to the club's tradition, the accession of new members was always noisily celebrated, and today was no exception. Kim took the floor, greeting Epikleon's associates. He wished each of them to find support and inspiration for the implementation of ideas. Jim, Ethan, and Oliver listened attentively to the senior, who was doing an excellent job as junior president of the community. The members of the most prestigious club at the university were various guys. Many of them came out as founders of the venture business. Having heard about risky investments in innovative enterprises, Jim suggested that half of them have been swimming in the river for a long time and not of their own free will. Kim went on to talk about prominent personalities from Epikleon who hold senior positions in leading companies at home and abroad. And to thunderous applause, he wished the newcomers to work hard and continue the traditions of their predecessors. Further, the children were given business cards of seniors who had already graduated from the university and achieve some heights in life. From one person to another, business cards quickly spread among community members. Ethan took out the brightest one from a pack of business cards and began to read the name of the famous company, amazed at every word. He felt out of place, as if he had entered a completely different world. To achieve big goals, Jim suggested starting with small steps and calm down the sudden feeling of envy in his friend. Gatherings with beer and chicken wings inspired the guy with a feeling of a heartfelt corporate party from a past life. Having sat enough, he decided to stretch his legs and, pushing back his chair, got up from the table. Jim fooled around with his friends, calling himself bro. He demonstrated excellent social skills, tightly wrapping his arms around the guys' necks. The sudden exclamation of the freshman broke the routine of the party and introduced an element of mystery. At the table opposite, a senior student who developed the design of a new car was peacefully talking. When the guys invited the elder to their table, he said that he had made a small contribution to the development, but the reaction to the invention shocked the world. The designer was happy to maintain a conversation with a caring interlocutor who tried not to overdo it with questions. Vivid emotions overwhelmed the first-year student. From an endless smile, he felt how his face was burning. Words of recognition, gratitude for his work, and public recognition added pride and confidence in his achievements. Jim, praising the development of the car, finally ingratiated himself with his interlocutor, and he called Chairman Kim to the table. He pointed in the direction of the newcomer and asked him to keep an eye on the freshman, seeing an excellent museum specimen in him. Others did not even try to surpass the new member of the team, who did his best to draw attention to his person. Feeling like the main and only player in the automotive industry, Jim stopped monopolizing the conversation. Introducing his classmate, the former president of the student council, the main character hurried to involve Ethan in a conversation. The idea of using the experience of a person reliving his youth was a very good decision for Jim. He involved the youth in the conversation and immediately passed the initiative to the elders, involving all those present at the holiday. Maintaining trust and openness in communication, a favorable, relaxing atmosphere was created around. Many of the guys found themselves in the shadows and often remained overboard, never feeling the proper recognition and attention of others. This was the first life of the main character, full of failures and a miserable existence in complete loneliness. Therefore, in this life, Jim surrounded his friends with care and did not forget to think about the other guys of the club. In order to quickly and safely find the way to your goal and become a respected person in society. The party quickly came to an end, and members of the community went home, seeing each other off. The designer of the car, holding out pocket money, asked Jim to contact him and chat the next time they met. In fact, the main character was 7 years older, but he did not earn decent money and could not afford charity. Today's freshman, of course, thanked the young man for the financial assistance provided and bowed low. Kim witnessed such charity. He, together with Jim, said goodbye to his senior comrade-in-arms, following the departing taxi car. When the taxi disappeared from sight, the newcomer to the club, not wanting to keep the donated money for himself, handed the bills to the president of Epicleon as a membership fee. Once again making sure that the guy had no flaws, Kim took money for the development of the club with a clear conscience. Despite the amount of alcohol he drank, Jim, praising his strong liver, thought clearly and did not look drunk at all. After saying goodbye according to all the rules of etiquette, he hurried to bow out until the next meeting. In the crowd of passing passers-by, the guy looked for his friends, but Ethan and Oliver had long disappeared over the horizon without waiting for him. After standing for a minute, Jim decided to take a walk alone, when suddenly an unfamiliar female voice called out to him. Turning around, he saw her, the beautiful Elsa, and did not immediately remember under what circumstances he had seen her before. The freshman disturbed his memory, and the unpleasant events of their first meeting ran through his head like a whirlwind. The desire to know the name of the beauty and get to know her better, the senior student took as a compliment. Jim's eyes, like a bottomless lake, reflected the sympathy that had arisen for the girl in a pleasant pastime. From the first year of study, Elsa became a member of the Epicleon Club and worked hard with her team on a personal project. The proposal to work together sounded somewhat unexpected and delighted the young man like a new toy for a child. The girl explained that when newcomers join the club, the departments begin to compete for each person. There are always a lot of participants, but there is a lot of work in each department, and having decided to act first, she offered to become part of the team of the communications department. An inner voice agitated the young man. He froze as if out of spite and stood like a pillar, unable to utter a word. Elsa chatted about the importance of her project and gave excellent results in the work of the department. And besides, she really liked the guy. Jim, like a naive child, wondered why he was the one to be asked to do outside communications. The girl, threatening not to show off, explained that she was the head of the department and made the decision on her own. Among other things, the department kept in touch with the elders and coordinated actions with the university administration and the student council. Elsa laid out all the arguments, but the guy did not dare to agree to such a flattering offer. The girl's patience reached its limit when the first-year student decided to choose a department after getting acquainted with all the participants of the Epiclean. She grabbed Jim by the neck, using a fighting move that was not characteristic of the female sex. Using force, Elsa forced the guy to agree to work in the external communications department under her personal management and supervision. Passers-by turned around in surprise, watching the girl's physical violence, but were in no hurry to intervene. Disheveled, Jim, adjusting his crumpled clothes, relied entirely on the opinion of his new supervisor. Elsa was immensely glad that the handsome man had joined her team and stretched out her hand to seal the agreements. And so Jim reluctantly accepted a future job in a little-known team in an unexplored department of external communications. So the wet autumn passed, followed by a cold winter and early spring. Gardens bloomed everywhere. Jim was walking along the alley of the university when in the bushes between the trees, he saw the figure of a familiar girl and an unknown man. The girl spoke in a raised voice from fragments of phrases. It followed that the young people were sorting things out. Jim deliberately slowed his pace. He recognized Elsa's voice and began to listen to a rather unpleasant conversation. The guy was a head taller than the fragile girl. He bent over her with all his weight and no longer spoke, but suppressed with his scream, drowning out the noise of the wind. Elsa blushed, her eyes filled with tears. She turned away and saw the freshman walking toward her. Approaching the guys, Jim called the girl by name. He witnessed an unpleasant scene and could not remain indifferent. The offender looked in the direction of the freshman with contempt, and like an animal instinct, he was seized by a feeling of jealousy. Bending over Elsa, the rude man glided around like a shadow, scorching his gaze, trying to attract her attention. Jim did not like the disgusting behavior of the young man towards the fragile, crying girl more and more, and clenching his fists, he was preparing for something important. To begin with, he wisely decided to talk before getting into a fight. He was the opponent not going to choose words, calling the guy a piece of shit. The thirst for revenge burned like fire in the heart of the brute man, and his eyes were filled with the blood of a beast preparing to attack. Nothing and no one, not noticing the vile guy around, prepared to prescribe a lul to the first-year student and swung to hit him. Elsa, like a shield, fearlessly wedged herself between the guys, trying to stop the consequences of the inevitable fight, and asked Jim to leave. The guy wasn't sure if this was the right decision. He looked inquiringly into the girl's eyes, worried if everything would be okay. The senior assured that there was no need to worry. She already felt ashamed after the awkward situation that had arisen. Offering the vile guy to talk in private, Elsa took his hand, directing him in the opposite direction. The young people retired into the thick of the garden. The sad girl walked in front, and the boy, continuing his rudeness, trudged behind her without unclenching his fists. Jim did not leave. He stood for a long time and looked into the distance with an anxious gaze, full of anxiety and compassion, until the figures disappeared from sight. Ethan waited for his friend under the shade of a spreading tree, while the freshman, after a failed act of rescue, returned to his plans. Today was a glorious day. The weather was great, but after the emotions experience, studying did not get into the guy's head. A childhood friend persuaded Jim to study a foreign language and not exclude the possibility of receiving an increased scholarship. Rethinking the possibility of living his life anew, the guy decided to direct all his energy to establishing connections and communicating with people. He did not want to succeed quickly. His main goal was to punish Michael's deputy so that such a person would not drive anyone to the grave again. It was for this reason that Jim joined Epiclean and, it seems, the friends switched places. Now only Ethan was interested in studying. A childhood friend, agreeing with a protagonist's decision to contribute to the club's activities, focused on his studies. But there was another important and unresolved question that excited Jim's imagination and worried him, and he hastened to share his thoughts about it. Ethan, without hesitation, assumed that spring had come in the boy's heart, and he mercilessly fell in love. But this was not the point. The freshman was worried about Elsa's problem, and it was necessary to deal with it urgently. The clock showed 6 in the evening when the girl modestly looked into the university auditorium. Through the glass of the door, she saw her morning intercessor engaged in an important matter and deliberately went inside. Jim did not waste time. He focused on the grades of the guys and called the laggards, thereby fulfilling the errand of the seniors. Promising Elsa to quickly deal with this task, the young man in a good mood made notes in the list in red ink. The girl was encouraged by the words of the first-year student, and assessing his excellent mood, sat down to watch nearby. The last telephone number was left on the list, and Jim hurried to dial it in order to complete the assignment of his seniors. With loving eyes, she caught every movement of the first-year student, his easy communication and relaxed behavior. When Jim finished, the time, as it turned out, was later. 2 whole hours of work flew by. Getting up from his desk, he notified Elsa, as the head of the course, about the end of the task and asked permission to leave the classroom. Upset, a miserly tear rolled down the girl's face. She certainly wanted to be alone for some more time. She had to become a virgin without delay, and she offered the guy to have dinner together, resolutely declaring that she had been hungry for a long time. Jim agreed. The offer was tempting. It was hard to resist fried chicken legs and a can of cold beer. The cafe was located very close, around the corner of the university on the next street. The guys were enjoying fragrant chicken legs with a crispy crust and had already drunk several cans of beer. When the last piece of chicken was left at the bottom of the box of chicken, Jim, like a real gentleman, offered to eat it to the lady. Elsa noted another positive quality of a first-year student. More often in her environment, there were not the most well-mannered people. The guy hurried to laugh it off, considering the received piece of chicken a bribe for a senior student. From that moment on, she asked not to be called the eldest anymore and smiled slyly, looking into his eyes. Immediately blushing with embarrassment, Elsa came up with a new nickname for herself, suggesting that Jim call her sister. While the young people were chatting casually and making fun of each other, Jim noticed a huge bruise hidden under the girl's hair. The mood immediately deteriorated, and accusations rained down on the young man that he was looking at her too closely. Without a word to be said in his defense, Jim was ordered to finish his beer in silence and not to interfere in his own business. Of course, she was wrong, because the manifestation of attention and care on the part of the first-year student caught to the core, and the problem was in plain sight. Stuttering with excitement, my sister was the first to break the silence and asked for something to talk about. The conversation never began, because a burly man burst into the cafe and called out to Elsa with his usual rudeness and disdain. It was her ex-boyfriend. He looked at the girl like a beast playing with its prey, catching her infidel. Tender and fragile, she sat in a daze. In the morning, they decided to break up and free each other from a meaningless relationship. While the rude man burst into the guy's place of rest with his fists, the girl reminded that the guy had no rights to her, and she was not his property. Her heart clenched with pain from resentment, but she did not allow the tears to break out. Offending and ridiculing with every word, the ex-boyfriend shifted all the blame to his beloved and tried to hit her harder. At this point, Jim could not stand it. Watching the scene of violence for the second time in a day, he grabbed the crazy bastard by the arm, ahead of his intentions. The concept of violence and the deliberate use of physical force was unfamiliar to an illiterate person, and Jim hastened to explain. If one of the lovers caused pain under the guise of love and care, this gave every right to a stranger to intervene in the situation. There was no need to worry. Despite his complexion, Jim was confident in his strength and taekwondo skills. Considering the young man a rival of their love, shaking the air, accusations and insults rained down on the guys from all sides. This time, the freshman definitely decided to teach the rude man a lesson and, shutting his mouth, offered to continue the conversation on the street. Promising Elsa to return soon, Jim assured her that she should not worry, but should stay here and finish eating the chicken. Even if Elsa wanted to stop the scuffle, this time she was powerless in her desires. When the guys came to the backyard of that university, a real duel between the two rivals was planned. One of them still tried to pacify the aggressor with a kind word, appealing to his conscience, and not a demonstration of force on a woman. The other did not hear anything, was the first to pounce on his opponent with his fists, using the surprise factor to take him by surprise. A clever move, and the rude man was on the ground, feeling the skill of Jim, who has good wrestling skills. The guy was not going to shake hands. He continued to moralize manners and treat his loved ones while he was rising. Getting up from the ground, Elsa's former lover attacked the freshman again, calling him an arrogant bastard. Jim immediately slapped him in the face. It seemed that the bastard was weak in everything and was not going to show the slightest respect for others. Meanwhile, Elsa, knowing the hot-tempered character of her ex-boyfriend, continued to worry about the freshman. She went to the table with a telephone and, stretching out her hand to the receiver, intended to call the police. Suddenly, a completely calm Jim appeared on the doorstep, and as if nothing had happened, he smiled at his sister. Now Elsa had to tell the long story of her life and her difficult relationship with the Rude. She said that the acquaintance with her ex-boyfriend Alex began in high school. He was then preparing to retake the entrance exams. Jim listened very attentively to how the guy was a good man, but after failing his exams 3 times, he worked there and ran away to the army. When Elsa entered the university, he seemed to go crazy, began to constantly beat the girl, causing her pain and insults. With a tormented heart, she continued her story, wiping away the tears that fell like hail from her eyes. Jim did not understand why his sister endured such humiliation and did not end the relationship a long time ago. It turns out that she felt sorry for her lover. Even in high school, he studied well and studied with her for free. It is painful to watch how a person who has the opportunity to find the right path in life breaks down against the background of his failures and defeats. The girl constantly felt a sense of guilt in front of a person whom she could not find a way to help. A freshman, he argued that you shouldn't blame yourself and it's high time to end relationships that poison each other's lives. Elsa went out into the street, where a brawl between 2 guys had recently taken place, and approached her former lover. Dirty and shabby, with his eyes down on the ground, he silently accepted her decision to break up. Jim, of course, stood at a distance and, watching the behavior of the aggressor, prepared, if necessary, to protect the fragile girl. Obeying Elsa's wish, Alex went into the darkness without saying a word goodbye. The poor girl, choking on surging emotions, fell to her knees and, covering her face with her hands, cried loudly. This is how Alex disappeared from Elsa's life. And even if these 2 people loved each other, there was a line that was not worth crossing. The April cherry blossomed, and for most students, this period meant passing the midterm exams. And when the flowers fell and the intermediate exams passed, the day of the anniversary of the founding of the Epicleon Startup Club came. And on this holiday, new participants testified to the strong, unique bond inherent in this club. Chairman Kim deliberately gathered all the freshmen who had recently joined and told the story of one senior in his ascent to Olympus. 2 years after joining Epicleon, the elder in question embarked on an adventure by opening a venture business specializing in online gaming. That year, all the venture capital companies went bankrupt, and being unemployed, he, like a lotus growing in the mud, became a legend of the club, achieving success. In this regard, it was decided to celebrate Millennial Day at the same time as the day of the formation of Epicleon and establish a holiday, Kim summed up. The guys were intrigued by the upcoming event, especially Ethan, who could not sit still, applauded loudly and expressed admiration. Jim looked at his friend and chuckled a little, amused by the emotion of the generation involved in digital technology in the new millennium. Since all the participants of the Epicleon were attributed to the millennial generation, Kim warned the guys to wear costumes for the holiday. Oliver, seeing Jim's confusion, asked if he had a suit, but Jim had neither the suit nor the money to buy it. It is difficult to afford such a luxury on a scholarship, and Oliver offered a friend to pay for the purchase of a suit, and for Ethan too. The guy, a former young master, had good intentions. It was a step of friendship and gratitude for saving himself from extortionists. However, the unsuspecting Jim always thought about the cost of such a positive attitude and refused to accept help. The club event took place in a luxurious location, a very high-end restaurant in the city center. People of different ages in chic suits and girls in elegant outfits gathered in the center of the hall, waiting for the start of the holiday. Jim also prepared. He nevertheless bought himself a new suit in classic black and, putting it on, entered the restaurant. Everything that was happening seemed like a scene from the highest-grossing film in the history of cinematography. All those present were very different, from appearance to position, but they still had something in common. At one time, all of them were accepted into the Epicleon Club and became its alumni, having achieved a certain result. It's only been 2 months since Jim joined a team of people with common interests and has already been invited to such a large-scale event. And it's been 10 years since the guy didn't live his life because of Michael's deputy and was still disgusted with him. But now the main character has decided to use any weapon to step over past grievances, without being like others and without stooping to meanness. His removal was directed around as if he was trying to catch something important or interesting when someone's hand landed on his shoulder. The friends greeted each other happily and exchanged their first impressions of the atmosphere and details of the situation. Welcoming words were heard from the microphone, and the current chairman and organizer of the event, Kim, began the opening ceremony. While the welcoming words about the significance of today's event for the club were heard, the friends took their places at the table for newcomers. The official part of the banquet continued, and Kim invited one of the graduates of Epiclean to the stage, asking him to greet him loudly. These were not ordinary applause. Sounding in gratitude to each speaker, those present clapped with special enthusiasm. For a welcoming speech, tonight's host Kim handed the microphone to a man an order of magnitude older than himself. The grown-up, elegantly dressed man introduced himself as Mr. Chuck Morris, the creator of Epiclean 25 years ago. "Alar, alalar, alalar," shouted those present in the hall, raising their hands up, performing a special ritual. Everything that was happening seemed strange to Jim. He explained to Oliver that this was the official slogan of Epiclean, meaning an ancient Greek military salute. Names and slogans known only to club members strengthen the bond between fellow interests, but they are not at all clear to other people. Random people were not invited to the community. Their life credo was either to live together happily or not to live at all. Continuing his speech, Chuck Morris spoke at length about his plans and new travels, and about his intentions to apply the experience gained to the world of technology. Jim did not approve of people engaged in self-promotion, who do nothing but describe the active promotion of their own achievements and qualities. But when the guy heard about Maurice's intention to create a cutting-edge IT company called AKD, he immediately determined how he knew this person. From his first life, Jim remembered how all the television channels showed the vice president of the AKD company, accusing him of stealing money through a shell company. Chuck Maurice, fighting off the police, shouted that he had been treated unfairly and threatened suicide. In the end, he committed suicide by sticking a huge kitchen knife into his chest, unable to come to terms with the plot against him. And now, at the Millennial Festival, Chuck Maurice, still alive and well, attracted young and talented people of Epiclean to his new project. Judging by the loud applause, the interests of many of those present coincided with his intentions. From Chuck's point of view, it is profitable for him to hire promising and loyal newcomers who are ready to make decisions based on trust in him. However, Jim, having a chance to live his life twice, did not want to face problems later, remembering the fate of the vice president of the AKD. Chuck Morris continued to talk about the prospects of the future company, and at the end of his speech addressed the younger students with interesting news. Today, the event honoring millennial graduates for their outstanding achievements in business was held for the last time. Hearing such news, everyone froze in suspense. It was just the beginning. The young ones had the opportunity to shine brighter than their older colleagues. Chuck Morris announced that tomorrow the entrepreneurship student competition will start, the name of which is the Post-Millennium Competition. At first, Jim didn't really understand what the respected founder of Epiclean was talking about. But the rules were simple. Each participant was given $1,000 as startup capital for the development of their project. The money must be multiplied, and at the end of the competition, the winner takes all the money along with the starting capital. There were 100 students in the hall, and Maurice immediately calculated that the starting capital was $100,000, and only one of them would receive all the profits. The main character's eyes lit up with interest, like small stars that suddenly lit up in the night sky, revealing something fascinating. Further, the founder of the club, Epiclean, invited the current chairman, Kim, to set out more detailed details of the competition. At this moment, Jim was fiddling with his pockets for an ink pen. He wanted to write down all the information on paper without losing sight of anything, but there was no pen. Then the guy turned to his friend Oliver for help in this matter. The chairman of the club, Kim, spoke about the timing of the competition, the size of the startup capital, and the conditions that prohibited the use of sports betting. Having got a pen, Jim was the only one from the audience who wrote down the announced rules of the competition in a notebook, with the indispensable intention of participating in it. In 1 month, the winner needs to receive the highest income, and then his reward will be all the assets, capital, and profit earned by other participants. Jim learned that in this competition, second place is equal to the last, since only the first will win. Kim continued to say that the guys will have to divide into groups and independently choose a leader who is entrusted with special powers. The head could expel members of the group at will, and an expelled student could not join another team. In addition, the leader was allowed to divide the prize money among the group members or keep it completely. After listening to all the information, Ethan asked Oliver if he understood correctly that the leader of the group has absolute power. When the official part came to an end, the host announced the beginning of the banquet and wished everyone a pleasant evening. Instead of enjoying a delicious piece of meat, Jim digested the information he had received about the competition. Because of his thoughts about the upcoming competition and the real chance to get rich, the guys could not eat properly either. The members of Epicleon, selected from all the students of the university, also fussed at the next tables, discussing the composition of their groups. The promised money attracted everyone, and in order to increase the chances of winning, students discussed the pooling of startup capital. Jim's only problem was the absolute authority of the team leader, and if he wasn't careful, he could be left with nothing. Watching the vile person opposite, the guy thought that such a person should not become a leader. Otherwise, the work would be comparable to porridge that he cooked for himself and gave to the dog. But Michael thought completely differently. He, of course, wanted to combine capital with Kim and Elsa, but he was not going to miss the leadership. The first group of 3 senior students was formed, and the nasty student asked who would be the leader among them. Elsa immediately proposed Kim's candidacy, especially since he was the chairman of the Epicleon Club. Without looking up from his plate, Michael briefly replied that he was against the proposed candidacy and continued to eat his steak. Kim looked in the direction of the guy, waiting for more detailed arguments regarding his candidacy for the position of leader. Michael said some nonsense about the authority of the chairman, who cannot be a leader at the same time. Otherwise, there will be confusion in the group. The senior student had long known the petty meanness of his classmate, but he was completely unaware of his soul, black as night. Nevertheless, Michael's opinion had to be taken into account and thought about nominating another candidate for the role of leader. By simple calculations, there were 2 options left, and modest Elsa hurried to clarify who the guy wanted to see in the leaders. The cunning, impudent man acted according to a clearly outlined scheme. He eliminated the main competitor and offered the girl to become the head of the group. Elsa's indecisiveness led to the expected events of the conceived plan, excluding another competitor. Mentally celebrating his small victory, the cunning man drank a glass of champagne alone. Decent Kim, observing the rules of agreements and respect for others, had to offer the place of leader to the remaining of their trio. Pretending to be a sheep that accidentally strayed from the flock, Michael played a scene of modesty and lack of confidence in his abilities. However, considering himself the basis of Epicleon, he quickly took the lead into his own hands and offered to invite newcomers to the team. He knew perfectly well that no senior would go under the command of a junior, and he should give priority to newcomers with whom it was easy to establish contact. And at this time, at the table of the first-year guys, Ethan offered his friends to unite in a group with Jim at the head. Our main character was not going to become a leader. He was appointed by default by his friends, trusting 100%. One issue was resolved. It remained to assemble a team of like-minded people, when suddenly the guy was called by name. A group of seniors, led by Michael, approached the first-year table, and the guys stood up slightly, leaning forward in greeting. As friendly and cultured as ever, which is not characteristic of the behavior of an impudent man, he invited the guys to join their team. Jim immediately tensed up and immediately realized that the bastard he saw in front of him had been elected captain of the team. Without hesitation, the young man spread his hands to the sides and announced the decision to act themselves as part of their small group of 3 people. Michael continued to persuade the boys to unite, but his sugary courtesy and cat-like look did not inspire confidence in the main character. It is necessary to act with liars using their own methods. And Jim, playing along with the interlocutor, insisted on the opinion of working with his friends on his own. Looking intently at the culprit of all the troubles of his past life, there was no doubt that he would never want to share money with newcomers like them. Elsa playfully went over to the side of the first-year students with a request to take her into the team, but the leader of the group also playfully refused the eldest. Continuing to flirt with the guy she liked very much, she reminded that she was a sister to him and insisted on taking him to the team, referring to the fact that no matter what Jim calls the girl, this will not allow her to become a freshman because there are only beginners in his team. She felt very offended. She did not know that the guy acted so deliberately, not wanting to cause a new wave of hatred of his enemy. There was nowhere to go, and the unfortunate Elsa was forced to return to the team under the leadership of Michael, who had long had his eye on the girl. Under no circumstances should he escalate the situation and take away the people he needed, and even more so, lure them to the other side. Having received a refusal, the senior student, with feigned irony, wished the guys to get a good experience, noting that they would be of little use. Using all the subtleties of good manners and upbringing, the phrase did not shake Jim's nervous system in the least, but only amused him. A defiant grin did not leave the senior student's face, and he went to agitate other newcomers, luring the guys from his team with authority. Left alone, Ethan offered to pool his capital with others, but the friends finally decided to be on their own. In addition, Jim thought that 3,000 startup capital was enough to start his own business. Skeptical, Ethan submitted to the will of his friends, although he himself was very doubtful about the success of this hopeless venture. The evening turned out to be very interesting and fruitful. The banquet was coming to an end when the three friends set out to snatch victory at any cost. The next morning, Jim and Oliver got up early and met in the lobby of the university to discuss the concept of the upcoming investment over a cup of coffee. In the near future, a football match was coming up as part of the World Cup, and the main character offered to design t-shirts for fans. Finishing his cup of coffee, Oliver happily picked up on his friend's great idea and agreed to design inscriptions for printing on t-shirts. Both of them sat and dreamed of how they would sell all the t-shirts on the internet and be able to earn a lot of money. But the question arose in limited time. It is difficult to sell goods quickly in a month, and then a young gentleman from a rich family came up with the idea of asking his parents to buy the entire batch. Envious of White Envy and enjoying his still hot coffee, Jim thought of the young man who could solve any problem with money. Rainbow pictures of wealth and prosperity were suddenly interrupted by the loud stomp of small women's feet. Unfortunate Elsa ran towards the guy with a sense of hopelessness and loss of self-control. She attacked the freshman, calling for responsibility for what he had done, accusing him of almost a crime against humanity. Swallowing the words and sobbing from tears choking her throat, the sister said that Michael wanted to kick her out of the team. In her words, one could hear a reproach addressed to a first-year student who, at a banquet dedicated to Epiclean, refused to accept her into his group. Michael's act to kick out the defenseless girl greatly angered Jim and sounded like a challenge to the hated enemy. To talk in a calmer atmosphere, the guys went outside and sat down on the nearest bench located along the alley of the university. It all happened when Michael, the self-elected leader of his team, offered Elsa and Kim to invest in shares and make a profit in a short time. He also recommended an investor, and the guys agreed to invest in the company's shares on the advice of a trusted person. The shares dropped sharply in price, and many newcomers who joined the team, thanks to its authority, and Chairman Kim went bankrupt along with them. More than half of the freshmen and almost all of the sophomores were trapped by Michael. Lured by trickery, he used people and then abandoned them. Elsa was not worried about herself and Kim. Their fate in the competition had already been decided by the right of the leader, but there were other guys who could suffer the same fate. A mean man pursuing his goals, mean in everything, but the rules of the competition did not allow Jim to interfere with the enemy team. The next day, Chairman Kim shared information that Michael had kicked out all of the first-year students from his class, and he had heard that many sophomores had been expelled for refusing to follow his instructions. Many, like Elsa, were dissatisfied because the team leader fooled everyone and coped with the task at someone else's expense. He nevertheless returned the startup capital to all the excluded, earning a round sum on the invested money, sufficient to win the competition. Kim also recounted how Michael finally expressed shame to his team members and returned the starting money as a gesture of goodwill. Elsa had never lost her composure, as she was now indignant at the behavior of a vile guy who had come to Epiclean only through connections. Jim analyzed the clever move of the impudent man to make money with the intention of attracting people to the team in a dishonest way. The essence of the Epicleon Club was the relationship between the elders and the younger. Michael plunged a knife into the backs of his comrades. Such a conclusion was voiced by Kim. Agreeing with the opinion of the chairman, the leader of the rookie team even praised his opponent for his clever tactics and warned Elsa about the unfavorable outcome of the case. The main character was worried about 100 deceived students, members of the club, and it is unacceptable to allow him to win the competition and stand out among others. Out of 100 participants, only one should win, but it is not a fact that he is more impudent and cunning, so immediate action is needed. Even at the banquet, Jim noticed that the organizer of the competition, Chuck Maurice, was a very cold-blooded and rational person. Having come up with such a competition, he initially knew the winner, the future and only head of the Epiclean Club, Elsa suggested. The difficult task was to catch Michael in pettiness on the way to victory, and Kim's brain began to boil from various assumptions. To believe that people are able to allocate $100,000 to play with human destinies did not fit in Elsa's head. Unexpectedly, Jim put forward a version of dirty money or the use of some kind of left-wing income. The guys went through the graduates of the university, honorary members of the club, and one of them was the Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade. It was rumored that this competition was part of a joint project with the ministry to educate young entrepreneurs. Kim continued to voice the version that the club put forward business ideas, and the department financed them, and this time it was about $200,000. However, only $100,000 were up for grabs, so the remaining 100 were pocketed before the contest was announced. Jim gestured. It was disgusting that none of the organizers cared what happened to the money or to the deceived students involved in a deceitful enterprise. The worst thing in this whole story is to recognize the merits of those personalities who did not deserve to be recognized at all. From the information received, Elsa became even more nervous, and in order not to go crazy from all this information, she was going to go for a smoke. The girl's bad habit was a surprise for the main character. He never noticed his sister's inclination to smoking. After making sure that the statement to smoke did not discourage the guy from communicating, she bloomed like a May rose, but still changed her mind. Time was ticking wildly, and the guys did not have sensible ideas on how to defeat Michael, and looking at the current situation, the mood in the team completely deteriorated. Attempts to ignore obsessive thoughts caused only anxiety and disgust in Jim, even more arousing the desire to get rid of the enemy. It remained to come up with a way to convince students to believe young, inexperienced first-year students and carefully remove the rotten part. A month later, a commission consisting of the organizers of the competition counted that hundreds of students, members of the Epiclean Club, would arrive. The speaker introduced the chairman, Chuck Maurice, and Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade, Ben Adams. Against the background of other guys, Michael stood, as they say, with his hands in his trousers, distinguished by arrogance and boorish behavior inherent in his personality. Jim was in the second row, behind his enemy, watching his smirk on the face of the impudent man, confident in his victory. The speaker announced to the judges that there was a significant gap among the participants and read out the total amount of money invested, adding profit and assets. The chairman immediately noted the abilities of the contender for victory, who managed to earn much more than other participants. The moment of the results is over, and it is time to announce the winner of a large-scale financial project for the students of Epiclean. After a little more time, keeping the intrigue, the winner was declared the second-year Michael. Chuck Maurice and Ben Adams applauded loudly, congratulating the guy with joyful exclamations, urging the defeated rivals to applaud with them. However, the students were reluctant to clap their hands, knowing that Michael won at the expense of others, embodying his cunning plan and accurate calculation. Loudly indignant, the organizer demanded that 100 of the losing guys pay due honor to the winner, deciding that they were all just jealous. The deputy minister also noticed the strange behavior of the students and recommended that young people learn to accept defeat with due dignity. With the feeling that the whole world was at his feet, Michael, rubbing his hands, ready to count the money received, went into the circle of the winner. The speaker said that by a huge margin from the second place, the student earned a colossal amount of $10,000. Chuck Morris emotionally expressed how shocked he was by the achieved result and how glad he was that the younger generation was a worthy replacement for the older one. As promised, the winner was entitled to the profit of all 100 participants, and the organizer hurried to find out the total amount of the prize. Peering intently at his tablet, the speaker was counting the results of the competition, and it seemed that he was deliberately playing for time. The expectation made the judges impatient. They asked to hurry up with conclusions and, in the end, announced the long-awaited result. Doubting the correctness of his calculations, the judge finally announced the figure of $30,000. The delight of the judges knew no bounds. With renewed vigor, they continued to praise the best club of the university, their brainchild, Epicleon. However, the fun turned out to be hasty, since the speaker meant minus $30,000, which he hastily clarified once again. Only after these words, real emotions were reflected on the faces of the organizers. No flattery and falsehood, sheer horror and disappointment. Michael let the snot out of his nose, and like a frightened rabbit in front of a boa constrictor, he shrank into a ball, experiencing a surging fear. One single person in the hall looked with satisfaction at the ongoing farce, recalling the events of a month ago. And a month ago, early in the morning, the members of the Epicleon Club, participating in the competition and leaving it by the decision of the team leader, gathered in the conference room. The university hall was increasingly filled with students, but no one present knew the reasons for the emergency meeting. When all the guests were assembled, Jim rose to the podium and first of all apologized for the urgency and unceremoniousness of the preparations. The question was so urgent that even the closest people knew nothing about the intentions of the friend. Before starting his speech, the guy carefully looked at the gathered incompetent losers, Michael's victims. It is not easy to convince deceived people, so it remained to change their perception of the situation and influence their thinking. First of all, Jim decided to give people who had lost trust in others the opportunity to throw out their pent-up anger. It remained to prepare a target in the form of a vile Michael, into which the guys would gladly want to plunge their spears. The guy began his beliefs with memories of the banquet, after which everyone became obsessed with the competition. However, by the will of one person, many of the students found themselves in a hopeless situation, and victory became completely unattainable. One of the seniors sarcastically suggested not to listen to Jim's regrets, but to get together in a bunch of losers and get drunk in grief. Many students were also in the mood, but the guy continued to say that the game should be fair, and whoever plays meanly should be punished. Michael had indeed acted unfairly with the majority of the students present, although he had never formally violated the rules of the competition. Jim went on to talk about the use of shady schemes to buy up investment stocks, which turned out to be ticking time bombs. The guy's voice sounded like steel. His fist fell on the table, time after time as he spoke about the damage done and the fulfilled plans of his sworn enemy. Only by getting rid of authoritative colleagues, Michael became an absolute leader. But this was only the beginning of the end. When the deterrence disappeared, he stopped worrying and did not hesitate to feed empty promises without guaranteeing their fulfillment. He called a team member who decided to complain a scoundrel and accused him of creating problems, and called the one who refused to cooperate a rude. He used these labels as an excuse to exclude from the team all chatterboxes voicing their concerns. Jim told the sad story that the self-proclaimed leader was initially not going to share the merit with other team members. The seniors were indignant. Some suggested that the bastard Michael should be kicked out of the Epicleon Club. Others should be expelled from the university. However, Jim offered to teach the offender a lesson in a different way, but this required the consent and participation of each of the students. There was practically no time left to earn money and bypass Michael, and the guys hypothesized what the freshman was up to. The genius of the plan was to altogether help the enemy lose, and the main character shared his plan of action for the next month. A month later, at the award ceremony, it turned out that 62 participants in the project simply spent the provided capital. In the adventure proposed by Jim, the loss to the students was estimated to be $62,000. Enraged, Michael, feeling bitter from the loss of his own money, called the guys crazy and demanded that the judges calculate the profit without taking into account the capital. Now, Chuck Morris could not stand it and recalled that according to the terms of the competition, the prize fund consists of the amount received from capital and profit. The organizers did not prohibit spending the received startup capital, but did not assume its squandering, and even more so in such an amount. If only profit is recognized as a prize, then Maurice needs to pay the missing money out of his own pocket. Frightened by his own thoughts that he would have to give his own money, he decided to put all the blame on the rat cub Michael. When the prize in the form of a fine of minus $30,000 was handed to the winner, the guy attacked the organizer with his fists. Chuck was not going to cancel his decision, especially since rules are rules, and menacingly ordered the crazy bastard to take the prize he received. Michael, of course, did not expect such a turn of events. Defeated as after a bloody battle, he repeated that this could not be. Everything was just beginning, and the chairman, with fury in his eyes, asked the students who was the instigator of the operation to embezzle money. Not at all embarrassed by the question asked, the students remained silent. Only some looked askance in Jim's direction. Assuming that the mass silence, a kind of rebellion among the guys, Chuck Maurice warned of further undesirable consequences. Chairman Kim was the first to break the silence by announcing a collective decision to spend seed capital. But such an answer did not satisfy the organizer of the competition. His angry roar, piercing the air and filling the entire space, demanded the name of the instigator. Jim was no longer going to hide behind the backs of the guys and boldly said that it was he who organized a protest against Michael's actions. In the same second, Kim raised his right hand and announced his personal initiative to gather all the participants and convince them to squander the capital. The consequences could be unpredictable, and our main character, stopping his friend's impulse, grabbed his shoulder. Elsa was also not going to stand aside. She boldly announced the despicable deception of all team members by the self-proclaimed leader. While Chuck Morris was conducting a personal investigation, Michael, all this time, pretending to be a victim, was waiting for a fair verdict from the judge. Accusations of meanness and betrayal angered the victim of circumstances and forced him to lash out at the girl with fury. Elsa told in detail how, after receiving a profit from the capital of the participants, he monopolized all the income for himself. A ray of hope for salvation flashed when the chairman declared that according to the rules, the leader of the group had complete power. The girl, continuing the position of the defense, noted that the expelled students, using their right, also did not violate the rules of the game. The victor believed that no one had the right to oppose him and constantly shouted stupid excuses, drowning out Elsa's words. He would have used his fists if not for Chuck Morris, who ordered the sophomore to shut up like an untrained puppy. On his knees, Michael pursed his lower lip, and like a faithful dog, looked at the organizer of the competition with a plea for help. After subduing the impudent man, Elsa announced the collegial decision of the students to direct the remaining capital to the needs and development of Epicleon. She also offered to use it for scholarships and funding the club's activities. The responsibility for what was happening lay on Jim's shoulders, and for some reason the elders shifted this burden to themselves, risking the consequences. Of course, Elsa was not fearless, but sympathy for the guy outweighed fear, and she winked at him in response to his concern. Standing behind his sister, the guy felt uncomfortable. He never hid behind the backs of others, no matter how many lives he had to live. After hearing both sides, the judge voiced his assumption, from which it followed that Elsa said the right things, but not particularly comfortable for him. And yet her story continued to get on the organizer's nerves and angered him to the core, stoking the flames around him. Chuck Maurice, without exception, yelled at all the guys, suggesting that someone had sent a curse on the Epicleon Club, along with its members. As a result, money prevailed over common sense, accusing the expelled students of wrong action and deliberate intent. The main character, thoughtfully looking into the distance, at that moment he was thinking about life values, love, understanding, and faith in people. Probably such personalities as Chuck Maurice needed individuals like Michael, cruel and indifferent, thirsty for money and power. A person with the same view of the world, selfish and ruthless, like aggressive wolves hunting their prey. With the perception of society through the prism of wild nature, where everyone is focused exclusively on their own interests and where there is no place for camaraderie. However, the main character and his like-minded people demonstrated by personal example that human society is different from the jungle. The guys showed others that kindness exists, and solidarity in general can dominate the interests of individuals. They proved that even a wolf and a sheep can be comrades, support, and, if necessary, give each other their own skin. This is how the students achieved their own justice, driving Michael into his own trap and leaving him completely alone. The final competition day ended differently for everyone. The participants went home, and 5 friends celebrated their small victory in a cafe. They drank a refreshing drink, clinking mugs and remembering an emotional day. Jim thanked Chairman Kim for his support in his difficult conversation with Chuck Maurice. Of course, the guy could not leave a first-year student to be torn to pieces by the graduate of the first stream of the university, the founder of Epicleon. All responsibility lay on the shoulders of the main character, but the guys considered the matter to be common, which means that they all had to answer together. The only girl in the company of guys, cheerfully and playfully, poked her finger into Jim's hand and offered to thank her for her personal merit. When she asked a risky question, she wanted to share something personal, but she immediately admitted her shyness by closing her index fingers. Kim immediately realized that a romantic relationship was beginning between the guy and the girl, at least on Elsa's part. Embarrassed by certain statements, she showed her friend a warning sign to keep quiet and not force him to blush. The atmosphere was conducive to conversations and jokes. Alcohol and food were bought at their own expense. So instead of forced smiles, the guys naturally laughed. A quiet, warm evening came imperceptibly. Evening lanterns were lit along the road, and the company of comrades gathered at home. In the middle of the alley along the bushes and trees, childhood friends slowly wandered towards the university, discussing their competitive business. Regretting the $500 earned by the team, Ethan recalled how hard he worked to sell shirts for the upcoming World Cup. Of course, if they were divided between them, the three friends would make a profit of $150 each. And for a student, this is not a small amount of money. All people are different and everyone needs money. So one of the friends lamented fate, and the other cheered both up. Jim believed that in every person's life, it is more important to have good people with open hearts. There was no need to discuss the negative aspects anymore. So Ethan agreed with his friend's opinion and approved that everything was not so bad. It was completely dark when the first-year students, embracing each other, silently walked towards the gates of the university. A few days later, after his university class, Jim walked leisurely down the stairs in the setting sun. The thoughtful guy was in no hurry. The competition was left behind. The prizes were distributed according to merit, and now there was nowhere to hurry. Going down from the last step, an unexpected voice from somewhere above made the main character turn around. Blinded by the bright sun, Jim shielded his eyes with his hand and began to carefully examine the male figure, trying to see the face. Some guy dressed in a tracksuit and a baseball cap hurriedly ran downstairs, defiantly repeating the name of the main character. Jumping over 2 steps at once, Michael rushed after him, his fist ready for a surprise attack. After the last day of the competition, having received his ill-fated prize, he did not appear in the Epiclean, and now Jim encountered it for the first time. Most likely, Michael found out who was the instigator of his defeat in the competition and angrily attacked the guy, threatening to tell about it. The freshman was not going to allow gossip around him, especially since he had strong arguments for not only Michael's involvement in the deception. The truth that surfaced about the uncle, the same investor who advised the contestants to unprofitable shares, threw the winner into bewilderment. His uncle had made a lot of money by deception, and Jim had learned this from his first life from his boastful deputy. In addition, during regular drinking, he also boasted that he personally received part of this profit. With contempt in his eyes, the main character aloud cited evidence of the complete failure and vile achievements of the dirtiest human bottom. The disgusting words burned out the interlocutor's brain. His irritation accumulated, and his fists clenched more and more. In a sickening voice, Michael hurled curses and poked his dirty fingers, predicting to wash his face with bloody tears. It was an extremely rash step, after which, cursing obscenities, the main character tensed and, rubbing his hand in hand, began to knead his fists. After the suggestion to deal with it in a manly way, Michael's emotional state forced him to roll up his sleeves. Before he had time to come to his senses, he immediately received a blow on the neck and flew face down the steps, making a helpless sound. The body of the villain was lying on the ground, and no one was going to help him, just as this bastard once indifferently watched Jim's death. The main character was not going to allow himself to be destroyed a second time, and hit him once more while he continued to lie on the ground. And then the guy slammed into the third and fourth time. He wanted to take revenge on the cold-blooded killer with his own indifference. Poor Michael, crawling on the ground, trying to avoid blows and covering his head with his hands. The dirty and beaten little man was ordered to fall through and not be seen, for his own good. Squinting in the direction of the freshman with a shaking head, he tried to get to his feet. And then he rushed as fast as he could, continuing to run on all fours like a driven horse that escaped from under the whip of its master. The motivation of his own desire to restore justice served as retribution for personal offense and harm caused to the injured members of the Epiclean Club. The magical time of the year came, when nature blossomed in all its glory, and the singing of birds filled the air with melody. Jim had been chilling lately, dipping himself into the green leaves of the trees, the delicate grasses and blooming flowers, while Ethan continued to study hard. A childhood friend wondered why the main character stopped going to Epiclean, suggesting a lack of interest. But perhaps there were some other circumstances. As it turned out, Jim just needed to abstract a little and postpone meetings at the club for now. In a world where there is light and darkness, the guy went through his own contradictions. He was attracted by the craving for knowledge, then by the fear of doubt. After recent events, he was sometimes overwhelmed by star sickness, and getting used to the role, he portrayed a great actor, fooling around in front of Ethan. Then the excited guy asked not to interfere with the training and sent a friend to get away from the Epiclean club. Jim was not exaggerating. His name was really mentioned at every club meeting, praising his high qualities and virtues. To prove his words, he crumpled the juice box and threw it into the garbage can, thereby showing that if you fly high, you will definitely fall. I didn't want to mention Michael's resounding fall, but the freshman Ethan still remembered the very young age of his friend. Only numbers reminded the guy of his 20-year-old age. But in fact, the story of his life brought new opportunities without age restrictions. Sometimes it seemed that some kind of grandfather lived in Jim. His conservative views and habits were associated with the older generation. In any case, if our protagonist knew a safe path, then he stuck to it. And if he had to choose between an excellent reputation and a good one, he preferred to choose the latter and temporarily not visit Epicleon. Left alone with his thoughts, Jim went to the garbage can and threw away the extinguished cigarette butt. The cigarette had not yet sunk to the bottom of the tank when a young girl called out to the guy, asking about the health of the body that had just smoked. It was Sister Elsa, delighted at the sudden meeting. She quickly waved her hand in greeting. It turned out that the young man was alive and well, but he disappeared somewhere and no one had seen him for a long time. Without changing his principles, Jim did not go to the general meetings of the club and lied to the girl that the World Cup was to blame. Intrigued, she didn't dare to ask if he had company to attend such an event. The guy had no friends except for the members of Epicleon, and since they were all present at the meeting, it means that he watched football alone. In fact, Elsa was interested in the question of girls, and the guy did not even try to hide the fact that he watched the championship with his classmates. She talked about the upcoming football match with Spain and was interested in plans for this day. How seriously Jim would take the proposal, the girl did not know, but she decided to try to invite him to go to the game together. Waiting for an answer, her heart beat faster. It was a chance to spend time together, share her hobbies, and maybe create something special. On the day of the match, the stadium was packed to capacity. Fans in red jerseys supported the players of their favorite team, creating a special atmosphere. To Elsa's surprise, her friend gladly accepted the invitation and also turned out to be the most ardent fan. Adding to the excitement was betting on predicting the outcome of the game, and Jim thought it couldn't be easier as long as he knew the final score. When the game began, Elsa was more nervous than the players on the field. She jumped, screamed, and sometimes threw herself in the air with joy. As it turned out, football is not just a game for her. She knew everything about the rules of the game, about the stars of the team, and about what result the fans expect from this meeting. The guy did not expect that football could cause such emotions and asked if the girl was really amused by everything that happens on the field. She had a lot of fun, especially around him, as if she was immersed in her story in real life, expecting something more. Unexpectedly, the commentator announced that the Spanish striker number 22 had taken the lead and was attacking the opponent's goal. Jim could not believe that the outcome of the game could be different from what he had done in his first life. The referee announced the players who were focused on defense, but the shot of the player from Spain sent the ball into the goal of our team. The goalkeeper tried his best, but the goal was inevitable, and the ball was confidently approaching the goal. Elsa was upset by the goal scored, and Jim, holding his head in his hands, could not look at the playing field at all. From the commentator's booth, the referee's voice thundered that our team went on a rapid attack and scored a return goal against the opponents. The joy of the fans knew no bounds. They rejoiced in the stands, greeting the striker with flags. When the goal was scored, happiness knew no bounds. The hearts of the guys beat in the rhythm of victory, forgetting about everything in the world. In this moment, they were one, like two football shoes made for each other. With a flood of joy, the guys imperceptibly found themselves in each other's arms, blushing with embarrassment. Waking up from their impulse, an awkward moment arose between them, and, as if in a parallel reality, words were no longer needed. When their souls met, time stood still, And in that silence, silence spoke more than 1,000 words. The hanging awkwardness was broken by a strange sigh from one of the fans standing in front of Jim. The freshman saw the man's hands shake and, losing consciousness, he slowly began to fall backwards. Fans did not pay any attention to what was happening, continuing to chant football chants, but the main character could not stand aside. Grabbing the man by the arms, he checked the pulse beat and concluded that he was not breathing. Seeing the lifeless body of a man, Elsa was frightened and confused, offered to call the rescue service. While the ambulance was on its way, Jim made attempts to resuscitate the man with artificial respiration. Folding his palms one on top of the other in the center of his chest, the guy counted the number of presses performed. The indifference and inaction of the people around was amazing. Everyone, without exception, continued to watch football with enthusiasm. Pushing the fans aside, Elsa made her way to the exit to meet an ambulance to escort her to a sick person. At the noise, the fans immediately turned around and surrounded Jim in a tight ring, who continued to give the victim artificial respiration non-stop. The time was critical, but the heartbeat did not recover, and the guy demanded not just to stare, but to provide access to an ambulance. A team of resuscitators with a gurney in their hands rushed to the emergency patient along a corridor of people. When the doctors examined the patient, thanks to the actions of the main character and Elsa, he remained alive, but urgent hospitalization was required. One of the doctors loudly addressed the crowd to find out if any of the relatives or guardians of the victim were present. Having returned to normal after hard work, Jim suggested that apparently the man alone came to watch the football match. Then the doctor ordered to accompany the patient together with them and at the same time examine the guy, thanking him for his assistance. The football match continued. The freshman did not complain about his health, and there were no intentions to go to the hospital. As soon as the doctor's hand touched the wrist, it became pointless to resist, since the persistence of the doctors left no choice. The friends had to run without looking back, since the man on the gurney could die at any moment, and there was less and less time left. With the siren wailing, the ambulance rushed to the nearest intensive care unit of the hospital. Accompanying the stranger, the guys watched his lifeless body with hope, swaying from the movement of the car. After the medical intervention, the man breathed his first breath, and immediately came the realization that the crisis was over. As a sign of relief from the situation and feeling the value of human life, the girl lightly touched her friend's hand. Some strange magic enveloped the guy and made him see something special in his sister's eyes, something that defies logic. Sweaty palms, a blush on her face, and a rapid heartbeat reminded me of the state of love of two young hearts. And at this time, the injured fan came to his senses, informing the doctor that his sick heart had again played a cruel joke. It turns out that the patient had long suffered from cardiovascular diseases, but did not listen to the doctors, ignoring the recommendations. The enraged doctor scolded the man who deliberately drove the body into a dying state. He was not going to shift the responsibility, but simply explained that everything happened because of the surging emotions when the player scored a goal. Jim intervened in the dialogue. It turned out that according to the patient, the striker of the team was to blame for everything. Shouting that both were to blame, the man was terribly angry at the freshman's remark, and only the feeling of weakness did not allow him to pounce on him. Observing the patient's aggression, the doctor hurried to intervene in the conversation and stop attacking the guy who saved him from imminent death. The truth cooled the ardor of a very weak man, and a little rising, he gratefully stretched out his hand to his savior. For Jim, there was nothing supernatural in the act, but the interlocutor gestured not to devalue his life. The guy tried to joke that he had done a good deed, skillfully maintaining a light conversation with a positive mood. It was time to get acquainted, and peering intently into the face of the freshman, the man introduced himself as Jason Parker. Or rather, he paid attention to Jim's eyebrows, noticing a stripe on one of them, which had recently begun to grow with new hairs. The next conclusion meant that if the hairs really grew on their own, the guy would still avoid trouble. Parker was fond of physiognomy and shared his knowledge in the field of determining personality type by facial features. Skillfully reading people and their personalities, the man promised to find Jim after he was discharged from the hospital. And in gratitude for his salvation, he held out a business card with his coordinates, inviting him to come and call at any time. As it turned out, Jason Parker was a respected man, the director of a small private firm. The satisfied freshman gladly agreed to accept the offer and promised to call after recovery. This is how the accident was the beginning of a new acquaintance with a man taken to an elite medical center. In the lobby of the hospital, the guys lingered in front of a huge screen where they broadcast the last minutes of the ill-fated match. Elsa continued to keep her fingers crossed for her favorite team, wishing with all her heart the cherished victory. The voice of the commentator was heard. From the announcement it followed that our team won and reached the semifinals. For a while, Jim doubted whether this was true because they had left the stadium, and his sister seemed to be happy. But still, something was missing. Late in the evening, they reached the nearest railway station and sat down on a bench while waiting for the train. The guy remembered an amazing man who talked about a stripe on his eyebrow, which brought bad luck. In order not to upset her friend, Elsa hastened to notice that the strip had really begun to overgrow, which meant that failures were not given to come true. The chance to live youth for the second time and correct all the mistakes of the first life was confirmed by the truthfulness of her words. She suspected that there had been a similar incident in Jim's life and tried to find out what kind of failure had befallen him. The sound of an approaching train was heard, and people slowly began to approach the platform for boarding. The guy hurried to get up from his seat, not wanting to tell Elsa what had happened and what the price of his failures was. But the girl stopped him, grabbing him by the arm and inviting him to sit down and continue the unfinished conversation. In fact, she really wanted to be together for some more time, and despite the arriving train, she offered to go on the next one. After this proposal, she hesitantly asked if the guy had feelings for her, and thereby greatly alerted Jim. The train stopped, the passengers flitted back and forth, and, not noticing anything around, hurriedly ran past the young people. When the station was empty, they continued to sit on the bench, timidly continuing their delicate conversation. Of course, the guy felt sympathy for the girl who did not let go of his hand. Otherwise, they were not so close now. Sometimes the most uncomfortable conversations lead to the most important changes, and Elsie realized that Jim was hesitant to make the first move. He doubted whether he could trust anyone else, remembering the breakup with his first love, whom he considered beautiful in everything. To make sure of her sincerity, the young man asked if her feelings for him were really real. Of course, Elsa had liked the freshman for a long time, and after a positive answer, the blush on her cheeks became the color of a t-shirt. The main character did not want to relive fleeting gusts of passion and then painful partings, and offered to sort out the feelings. Getting to know each other better without being in a relationship might have been the right thing to do, but Elsa was very upset by this answer. The reason for this decision was Jim's conscription into the army 6 months later, and having bitter experience. He was afraid of a long-term relationship. The guy explained that the army would take 2 whole years, but the girl did not see this as a problem, promising to wait for him. Having seen everything in the army, Jim found it impossible to maintain a long-distance relationship, especially for a long period of time. Therefore, he insisted on waiting, and during this time, he got to know each other better without any promises and betrayals. Then Elsa, in love, hastened to ask if the guy would be jealous if she met another man during this period. The next train drove up to the platform, and Jim, in order not to be late, hurriedly took the girl by the hand, inviting her to go to the car. True love is manifested not in jealousy, but in care, support, and attention, so he replied that he did not deserve such an attitude. He abruptly let go of the girl's hand, saying that, unfortunately, he did not feel the same way. Standing next to each other, Elsa continued to find out the reasons for this behavior, assuming that the guy's eyebrows were really to blame for everything. Such indecisiveness, and even at the age of 20, made the girl very angry and, calling him a loser, she sharply pushed him in the chest. After such a trick, the girl entered the car, and the main character, rubbing the place of the blow, could not utter a word. The train doors were closing, and he, faced with an unexpected turn of events, remained on the platform. Regretting what had happened, Elsa left without raising her eyes, with a feeling of loneliness and complete disappointment. Meanwhile, on the empty platform, in the shadow of the old train station, Jim watched the train disappear. Until the end of the semester, the guys never met again. Life went on as usual, and many students were busy preparing for exams. One summer day, Jim went in search of the company, the director of which, as a sign of gratitude for his salvation, handed the guy a business card with an address. In a rather spacious office with oak furniture and soft sofas, Jason Parker ran a small company, Imperial. There was a knock on the door, and he was forced to tear himself away from his important documents, inviting a visitor to enter. While the main character was greeting, the assistant director, accompanying the guy, was waiting for further orders from the director. With undisguised delight, Parker greeted his savior, hurrying to meet him. Overwhelmed with emotion at the moment of their meeting, they shook hands firmly, as if they were old friends after many years of separation. The manager is often busy with important documents, and the guy wondered if he was taking the director away from business too much. Putting aside all serious affairs for later, they sat down to drink a cup of coffee and talk about everyday affairs and immediate plans for the holidays. Jim's plans were to improve his English, but Jason offered to work for him instead of a pregnant secretary and earn pocket money. As a rule, maternity leave was not provided for in the field of small or medium-sized businesses, but the manager could not allow an employee to lose a child. Highly appreciating the positive qualities of Jason Parker, the main character thought that such people can be found infrequently. It remained to get consent to the offer to work temporarily, and the director once again expressed his intention to hire the guy. Killing two birds with one stone was a very tempting offer. Firstly, to earn some extra money, and secondly, to improve his skills. The announced conditions provided for a 6-day week from 9 to 6 and a monthly salary of $1,000. It is difficult to think that such conditions were offered to a first-year student, and he gladly agreed with the proposed option. At last everything was settled, and in expressing his gratitude, Jim thanked the headmaster for his confidence. Already at home in the student dormitory, instead of the English classes promised to Ethan, the guy sat down to work at the computer. A childhood friend immediately realized that Jim had found a part-time job during the holidays and envied such luck. Throwing the textbook aside, he collapsed on the bed, lamenting his fate and lack of the same luck. The feeling of annoyance caused by his friend's well-being upset Ethan, and Jim hastened to explain that he had put in a lot of effort. But his real luck could be called a return to life after death, but no one should have known about it. Suddenly, a childhood friend remembered the agreement to study languages during the holidays, but everything remained in force and they decided to study in the evenings and weekends. Making a stupid grimace on his face, Jim made fun of his friend, praising his merits on purpose. In the same joking manner, Ethan called his friend a braggart and, taking advantage of the circumstance, drove a textbook in the face. The morning of the next Monday came, and instead of a well-deserved rest on vacation, all roads led to the office of a small company. Glancing at his watch, Jim, dressed in a black business suit with a briefcase in his hands, entered the lobby of the Imperial Company. He arrived half an hour ahead of schedule, all because in a previous life, his deputy Michael demanded to come to work in advance. The first working day in a new team is always exciting, so in front of the office doors it was necessary to collect your thoughts. Exhaling, Jim reached for the doorknob when he heard unfamiliar voices discussing the arrival of Han Industries. The name seemed very familiar, and he plunged into memories, looking for information about this company in his head. While the freshman was thinking about Han Industries, two employees approached him. They were discussing the upcoming fierce struggle between the two companies. Not immediately, of course, but Jim did remember that the company had once belonged to the father of his high school classmate, Austin. The young people, seeing the indecisive guy, politely asked what his name was, and after answering, Jim bowed, greeting them. The guys knew in advance that a first-year student was hired, who would temporarily replace the pregnant assistant director. Delighted to meet the newcomer, one of the employees stretched out his hand to the guy, introducing himself as the head of the sales department named Harry. The main character immediately discovered an external resemblance to the director Jason Parker, assuming that this is his son. The second young man with similar facial features also extended his hand, introducing himself as a Gustav sales employee. In small and medium-sized businesses, members of the same family often work together, so this fact did not surprise Jim at all. Asking the employees to help get up to speed, the main character, in turn, promised to assist in the development of the company. The young people were surprised at the competent speech of the guy, not at all like a recent schoolboy, and entered the office in a good mood. Thus, in a friendly atmosphere and a desire to earn an excellent reputation, the first working week at Imperial flew by. Gustav and Harry had been watching the newcomer and his dedication to his work, and the boss was really good at understanding people. Jim was never late. He took the initiative, and the praise from the staff was well-deserved, but still embarrassed the inexperienced student. The head of the sales department, Harry, highly appreciated the guy's work, concluded that now Jim would deservedly be called an assistant. The main character had not heard such an address for a long time, since his first life, which he was immensely happy about. The next day, Harry had an interesting conversation with the guy and told him that Samley's company was choosing a new business partner. This was not news, and Jim had even heard that the head of his department had been put in charge of the matter. However, the head of the sales department had something telling him that he would have to take the partnership with Samley into his own hands, and in this regard, he needed the help of a newcomer. He did not doubt the abilities of the guy, but careful preparation is necessary since a meeting of shareholders is scheduled for next week. Promising to reward the freshman if he won, Harry held out a folder of documents about the export of blenders to China. The Imperial Company believed that this product would sell well, but still one of the competing companies was worried. The competitor turned out to be a fairly well-known company in this industry, Han Industries, the same one that Jim accidentally heard about on his first day on the job. And despite the many advantages, Imperial blenders were still inferior to competitors due to the lower number of revolutions. Focusing on the conversation, Jim listened to the characteristics of the model, which can still reach speeds of up to 20,000 revolutions. But no matter how much Harry thought about this problem, it all came down to a limited budget, which did not allow them to get the same speed. It was necessary to figure out where Han Industries got such technology. They could not torture aliens. The working day was long over, the evening was replaced by late night, and bright stars scattered in clusters in the dark sky. Jim could not sleep at home. Sitting at the computer, he was intently studying the documents that the head of the sales department handed to him. According to the characteristics, the speed of Han Industries blenders really exceeded 5,000 turnovers, and this figure could fail the deal. It was necessary to take some urgent measures, but the guy, looking at the scattered documents, thought about where to start. A minute later, my fingers tapped on the computer keyboard, looking for any information about a competitor's company in a search engine. Remembering another important point, he made sure that the company still belongs to the family of his classmate Austin, and it is he who manages it. Now it was necessary to find the bully Mason, who was directly related to this family, and Jim hurried to dial his phone number. After exchanging a couple of short phrases about student life, there was a request to find out from my uncle what was going on in Con Industries. Promising to help the next morning, when everyone was in a hurry to work, Mason went to his uncle's factory, where he had once worked. The head of the competing company did not even have to be searched. He himself called out to the guy, recognizing his nephew from behind. They had not seen each other for a long time, and during this time the thug had become a real man, and his uncle happily patted him on the shoulder. Next to them, with his back turned back, a guy was chatting on the phone, and Mason assumed aloud that it was Austin. His uncle confirmed his guesses, remembering that the guy studied in the same class, and, without choosing expressions, called him a damn bastard. Since then, Austin has not changed. Having an arrogant character, he still showed arrogance and contempt towards others. The nephew asked how things were going in business lately, and the uncle, sighing heavily, replied that it was better not to ask. And things were such that while others were working, his son Austin thought he was more important than the main one, and he himself was just doing an internship. In fact, he did not work at all, but chatted on the phone all day long, telling friends how he was forced to vegetate in his father's small business. Not paying any attention to the surrounding employees, he threw his legs on the table and, lying half, swayed in his chair. Impudent to the limit, the son did not even notice the head of the department, believing that he endured all these inconveniences for the sake of his father's reputation. The lunch break was long over, but Austin continued to chat on the phone, and the head of the department had to ask to stop the farce. He was not going to show due respect for the boss, as well as react to his remark about telephone conversations during working hours. Slamming the lid of the phone loudly, the impudent man jumped up from his chair and, like a jester in front of the emperor, grimaced, began to bow. The boss did not expect such a reaction from the young man and was silent, listening to aggressive statements that no one dared to reprimand him. To calm down the raging guy, the head of the department tried to smooth over the conflict and took back his words about the remark. However, this decision was fatal, as Austin demanded an immediate public apology. But mere words of apology to the vile son were not enough, and he demanded that the boss kneel. This was followed by a threat of dismissal and a weighty argument that concerned the family of the leader, or rather his child. The boss knew that Austin could easily deprive him of his position, which meant that there would be nothing to pay for his daughter's education. After weighing all the pros and cons, experiencing the humiliation of a collision with an arrogant person, he made a desperate decision for himself. Fearing for his fate, he knelt before the young son of one of the owners of the Han Industries company. From what was happening, all the employees who witnessed such bullying came to their senses for a long time, having experienced a severe shock. The head of the department, suppressing his self-respect, lowered his gaze to the floor, begged for forgiveness. Having achieved the desired result and satisfied his cruelty, Austin, with a smile on his face, advised his boss to behave appropriately in the future. It was not difficult to find out about this situation in a competing company, and soon the phone rang in Imperial. Jim listened attentively to Mason's story about intern Austin and the humiliation of employees, but there was another important fact for the upcoming deal. A friend told me about an elderly grandfather who did not have a permanent place of residence, who became a victim of the Han Industries company. The main character asked to organize a meeting with an elderly man, and, if possible, it is desirable that it take place this afternoon. They agreed to chat some more time, and thanking a school classmate for his help, Jim hung up the phone. After that, it was necessary to discuss with Harry the blimper product, released by competitors at the end of last year, and he went to it. The name of the product seemed unfamiliar to the head of the department, since at that time Imperial was focused on the development of new fans. But after talking to a school friend, Jim definitely had something telling him that he needed to dig in this direction. It remains to agree with the elderly person and get an agreement to meet at the next lunch break. The canteen was located next to the company's office and was always crowded at lunchtime, and it was there that the main character was waiting for his guest. When they met, the guy took a table in advance and, having paid for lunch, offered to pour a refreshing drink. A modestly dressed man greedily drank cold lemonade, and in the meantime, Jim talked about the reasons for such a quick meeting. Of course, the elderly man could refuse to participate in the conspiracy against Han Industries, but for the offenses of past years, no mercy should be expected. With the grandpa's consent, they discussed a plan of action and agreed on a time to meet on the day of the presentation. A very important day had come for the company where our protagonist worked, and Harry was worried about whether everything was ready. He was very nervous, and this exciting feeling was transmitted through the air from the manager to the employee. Jim saw the head of the department being shaken by the upcoming briefing and assured him that everything would go well and there was no need to worry so much. No doubt determined to give his best and win the deal, Harry took a decisive step forward on the road to success. In his previous life, the bullying of Michael's deputy forced him to curse his colleagues, and today Jim sincerely supported his boss. The main office of the large trading company, Samley, was located in the center of the city and amazed with its grandeur and beauty. Harry and Jim arrived at the meeting at the appointed time and walked confidently into the meeting room. Hearing the sound of approaching heels behind them, the guys turned to look at their competitors. A young man in a gray suit and a slender middle-aged woman reluctantly greeted the Imperial staff. Jim immediately recognized his classmate Austin and was surprised to see trainee Han Industries there. However, the actual owner of the company, feeling the importance of the upcoming deal, decided to personally take part and capture the receiver. Well-mannered guys from a small, competing company greeted Director Emmy with a bow. She sarcastically noted that the head of the department invited a high school student to be an assistant and concluded that there were problems in the company. After praising the young and accommodating employee, Harry did not remain silent. Besides, Emmy's companion also looked very young. The comparison of some boy with her son, the successor of Han Industries, greatly outraged and angered the woman. Austin arrived at these negotiations as the manager of the company, and recognizing his classmate, whom he had not seen for a long time, waved to him. To a friendly greeting, the guy reciprocated, pretending that he was glad to meet with a school friend. The mother was surprised at the acquaintance of the guys and asked her son what connects them and how they know each other. An ordinary guy from an ordinary family? This is how the arrogant young man described Jim to his mother. This turn amused her a lot, and she became curious to watch the upcoming presentation of competitors. Jim agreed that the event would be a good experience, but added that he had had a great experience while studying with her son. After hearing the words, Austin, who had already disliked his classmates since high school, held an even greater grudge. Having finished the verbal skirmish, the guys from Imperial bowed out and hurried to the meeting room to prepare for the presentation. Emmy's owner did not like the dialogue with Jim. She considered the guy rude who raised his head too early. Promising his mother to take advantage of today's chance and show the real taste of life, Austin called the guy a piece of shit. Representatives of the Somley Company closely followed the performance of Han Industries, who were the first to present their development. Emmy talked about the exceptional technical ability of the Dagar blender to develop a knife rotation speed of 20,000 revolutions. The receiver, confident in his own victory, listened to his mother with a smile on his face while she praised her product, trumping the best characteristics. Deliberately comparing Dagar with the products of competitors, she emphasized that the cutting ability directly depends on the rotation speed of the blades. Managing Samley needed to weigh the pros and cons and make the right choice in favor of one partner or the other. He applauded the speech of the representative of Khan Industries and noted aloud the clear advantage in terms of the speed of the Dagar blender. It remains to present his product to the Imperial Company, and the main meeting invited the next applicants. Smiling, the head of the largest company was looking forward to the demonstration of the product of two young people. Harry was greatly excited by Emmy's performance, and just before he left, he began to have doubts and even began to shake. But retreating is not in the rules of the Imperial, and concentrating on his presentation, he headed to speak to the assembled audience. Meanwhile, Austin, pleased with his mother's excellent result, whispered to her that the deal was almost in their pocket. Of course, Jim was not satisfied with this outcome of the negotiations, and he focused on the performance of his companion. This was just the beginning when Harry confidently asked to be allowed to introduce the audience to an Imperial blender product called Mix. He did not refute the impressive performance of competitors and immediately confirmed that their products were indeed inferior in terms of cutting capacity. Manager Samley hadn't expected this approach and had even thought of stopping further presentation. But Harry asked a strange question. The young man suddenly asked if the audience in the audience liked playing baseball, and whether the pitcher who falls at high speed is always the best player on the team, and of course that there is no right answer. The chairman agreed that regardless of the speed of the pitch, the athlete cannot be called a good pitcher if he does not feel the ball. After such a comparison, Harry smoothly approached the products of competitors who focused only on high speed. Sensing her shaky position, the owner of Han Industries clung to her rival with a sinister look. She, together with her ill-mannered son, jumped up from her seat and yelled at the speaker not to dare to weave far-fetched analogs. Despite the outrage, Harry continued to talk about how Han Industries was deliberately keeping silent about how exactly their device worked. Finally, looking at the vicious faces of competitors, he was tantamount to the worst pitch in baseball, comparing their product to a killing machine. Harry didn't say anything new, but still, the head of Samley thought for a moment, not expecting such a turn from the Imperial Company. An indignant family of competitors shouted from their seats that all this was slander and demanded justice. The chairman did not like the farce in the meeting room, and besieging the raging personalities, he warned that no one had given them the floor. Snorting back, owner Emmy and her successor Austin sat down in their seats with obvious displeasure. There was a tense silence in the boardroom, and as Harry continued his speech, for some reason, he began to introduce last year's Han Industries product called Blemper. On the screen, the characteristics flashed exactly the same as those of the Dagar blender with the same rotation speed, which had already been presented by competitors today. And after these words, Emmy, the owner of the Han Industries company, understood what this whole performance was about and became very nervous. It remains to mention one nuance that the production of the Blemper model was discontinued 2 months after the start of sales. And the backstory began on the day when Jim, after talking to Mason about the suspicious affairs of a rival firm, reported everything to the head of his department. Having discovered a strangeness in the intervals between the release of blenders of improved models, the guys decided to conduct their own investigation. The report showed that a new product was regularly released every 4 months, but 10 months had passed since the 5th Blemper. But another strange thing to Jim was that it was at that time that competitors changed the name of their products to Dagar. And he showed Harry an article in the newspaper where a small media company had published a report on the release of the 6th generation improved Blemper by Han Industries. The last article of this publication was published a few months ago, and it followed that the publishing house ceased to exist. Harry thought about the content of the article, which was clearly promotional in nature and was written at the request of the manufacturer. Why the manufacturers did not turn to major economic publications for advertising also remained a mystery to the children. Searching the computer couldn't find out anything else, and Harry assumed that the rest of the material had been removed from the internet. Having summed up the search, Jim concluded that it was not an expensive blemper with a 20,000 speed of rotation of the blades, about which nothing else is known. But in addition, the blender was renamed Dagar, and this fact most embarrassed the head of the Imperial Sales Department. And today at the presentation, Harry tried to explain using the example of baseball that if you take a strong pitcher to the team, then why immediately transfer him to the second lineup? The commission, headed by the chairman, suggested that it may be too fast and this is not always good. This was the correct answer. In other words, high-speed serves become a killing machine, the speaker concluded. This approach to the matter angered the owner of Han Industries, and she demanded that competitors present their products and not engage in propaganda. Anticipating such a turn, Harry calmly asked for permission from those present to invite the affected family to the presentation. At this point, Emmy and her successor Austin immediately tensed up, assuming what this whole performance could turn out to be for them. The audience was intrigued, and having waited for permission, an employee of the Imperial approached the front door. At the entrance to the meeting room, an elderly grandfather, whom Jim had met some time ago during his lunch break, was waiting for his finest hour. As the old man staggered inside, Emmy prepared to pounce on him, realizing that it smelled fried. Judging by Austin's reaction, it was the first time he had seen the old man and demanded some kind of explanation from his mother. The curious gaze of everyone present with interest and impatience was directed towards the grandfather. Harry broke the silence with stories of how the Imperial staff had conducted their own investigation. But the worst thing in this whole story turned out to be that the elderly gentleman lost his wife because of a blemper blender, a product of Han Industries. After such news, the shocked head of Somley and his crew, shocked with horror, froze, waiting for details. Attending such a presentation for the first time, Austin thought he had lost his sanity, and everything around him seemed crazy. The modest old man, clutching an old sweater in confirmation of the sad events told by Harry, assured that he had really lost his wife. Reliving the stress he experienced, the elderly man decided to talk about the tragedy that happened that day. Suffering from diabetes, the wife, on the recommendation of doctors, regularly cooked a vegetable or fruit smoothie, and the morning of that day was no exception. For these purposes, we bought a new blemper blender from Han Industries at a very attractive price. But as soon as he was turned on, he was grinding food at a breakneck speed and suddenly began to shake terribly. As soon as the elderly woman turned it off, the knife suddenly jumped out of its place and flew in her direction, spraying the contents around. Hearing the frightened scream of his wife, the grandfather hurried to the kitchen to help and see what had happened there. He saw a terrible picture as if from a mystical thriller, where his wife is lying on the floor and everything around is spattered with blood. Next to her lay a bloody knife from a blender, which bounced off and instantly slit her throat. In confirmation of his story, the old man unfolded a bloody lilac jacket, which he had been carefully pressing to himself all this time. Emmy immediately tried to shut up the elderly gentleman, remembering the money the company had paid him for silence. Everyone present was thrown into a state of shock. Their blood was draining from their faces, their skin was becoming pale, and their hearts were beating faster. From that money, the old man did not spend a penny. He could not spend the money in which the perpetrators measured the value of his wife's life. Worried about the events of that day, he sobbed, clutching his wife's bloody sweater in which she died suddenly. Our protagonist thought sympathetically about the poor woman who, caring for her sick husband, went to the other world before him. But apparently not everyone was sorry for this sad story, because Austin jumped up from his seat and headed towards his grandfather. With his fists at the ready as if about to fight, the receiver cursed the sick and helpless old man, threatening him with reprisals. Coming close, he took green bills from the inner pocket of his jacket and threw them in his face with the words, "Take it and get out." But it was not to be. Jim swung, not going to look at the humiliation of the elderly gentleman who had already suffered at the hands of the owners of the company. With all his strength, he slammed into his vile classmate, so much so that he collapsed to the floor, wailing in shame and pain. Immediately, the mother jumped out in defense of her successor, calling Jim a bastard and attacking with her fists. The arrogant lady swung at the guy with her right hand in order to smash her son into the offender with all her strength. Predicting her intentions, the Imperial employee intercepted her hand, gripping her wrist tightly. Looking into the eyes of insignificant people who killed two, He meant not only the murder of a woman, but also the moral destruction of a sick old man. Snatching her hand, the enraged Emmy yelled at the young man that all accusations were inappropriate, especially from a man whose milk was not dry on his lips. The conflict heated up, and the chairman, menacingly, ordered the director of Khan Industries to stop the farce. Outraged by the deliberate deception and without holding back his emotions, he furiously announced that the Samley Company would not deal with Han Industries under any circumstances. Emmy did not expect such a turn of events and said that the head sold himself to competitors for a certain amount of money. It is not permissible to hear such an unexpected accusation addressed to oneself, and a verbal skirmish broke out between the two directors. The deal for Han Industries fell through long ago, but Emmy couldn't calm down, continuing to blame everything on Harry, who brought the old man. The conflict between the participants became more tense, and no one paid attention to Austin, begging for a helping hand. With the good intentions of employee Jim, Imperial partnered with Samley, and everyone else got what they deserved. After such difficult negotiations, in gratitude for the assistance provided, the guys invited the grandfather to the nearest cafe. They discussed life, which, as it turned out, does not always go according to plan, and people in high positions are sometimes inadequate. Pouring a refreshing drink, the elderly gentleman noticed that despite the humiliation, he still felt better. While Grandpa was thanking the guys, Harry seized the initiative and offered to pour a drink. Though the decision was difficult, a slight smile crept across the old man's face, grateful for the opportunity to face the murderers. There were many reasons to drink, and without noticing the time, everyone celebrated their victory, sitting up late at night. The next morning, in the office of the Imperial Company, there were lively discussions about the outcome of yesterday's negotiations. Over a cup of hot coffee, Jason Parker handed out well-deserved awards to Jim, consisting of bonuses and company shares. Cooperation with Samley implied a long-term perspective, and the director, gifting the main character of the transaction, did not want to hear a refusal. Gladly accepting 500 shares of Imperial stock as a gift, Jim thanked him for such a financial safety cushion. The director liked that the guy always talked to the point and regretted that their cooperation was too short. In turn, Harry shook his assistant's hand firmly, believing that the guy would be successful in any company. Jim was happy to work under Jason Parker, but the summer holidays flew by, and soon he had to start studying. Leaving the office gates with shares in his pocket and a bonus like a 2-month salary, the main character returned to student life. It may be just a premonition, but it seemed to him that in the future the shares of Imperial would be very useful to him for establishing connections, and it was not worth selling them. At the end of the summer holidays, the second semester began for university students. Having gained experience over the summer, the confident Jim met with Oliver to talk about the upcoming training plans. A friend asked if a classmate was thinking of attending the Epiclean Club, but at that moment his mobile phone rattled in his pocket. On the other side of the phone, the Epicleon's external communications department was asked. The voice in the receiver introduced himself as the secretary of the Palace Group Company, and the guy immediately began to dig into his brains, looking for information about the company. It was the largest corporation, consisting of several independent companies operating in different industries. To attract customers, they combined Palace and Group, and as a result, it turned out what happened. The chairman of the corporation, Mr. Thompson, was one of the founders of Epicleon and a typical representative of the rich in the second generation who took over after his father. Jim and his department had to come up with a startup, and they were given $100,000 as support. Wondering what he was talking about, Oliver watched his friend as he thanked the secretary for the opportunity. After finishing the phone conversation and hanging up, the main character heard the question tormenting his classmate only on the third try. After the answer received, the guy was stunned by the announced amount of very decent money. After the phone call, all roads led to the Epicleon Club to share the good news with the head of the department. Kim and Elsa listened carefully to Jim and decided to cancel all the programs scheduled for the second semester and focus on the startup. The head of the department immediately had a difficulty with the choice because he had to find a good idea and come up with something new. The Palace Group Secretariat was not informed of the limitations of the project, a fact that baffled Chairman Kim. Seeing the confusion of the guys, Jim proposed the idea of creating props that would improve the corporate image. It seemed to him that the corporation headed by Thompson had addressed them with a rather simple request for a reason. Kim recalled a recent incident between the director of one of the companies that are part of the corporation and an ordinary secretary. The only son of the head of the corporation, the director of one of the partner companies, insulted and hit an employee in the face an order of magnitude older than himself. It was because of this incident that the image of the Palace Group suffered, and therefore they decided to support the club at the university and call Jim. As a result of the conversation, the guys decided to develop an item that can improve the company's image and consider proposals at the next meeting. The next day in class, an excited Ethan showed Jim an article printed in the university newspaper. The article talked about the Palace Group Corporation, which became famous because of the scandal, which allocated $100,000 to Epicleon, whose budget is already many times larger than the rest of the clubs. In the text, the main character read intensely about discrimination and infringement of the rights of members of other clubs who did not receive their jackpot. It all looked like an outright attack, but the guys certainly did not cooperate with representatives of other clubs. Ethan believed that the support provided was a natural process, as Epicleon is one of the oldest clubs. What kind of discrimination was in question was not entirely clear, but the problems of the guys were already looming. The atmosphere around them changed, and when they saw the glances that squinted in their direction, they felt like black sheep. After the classes, the guys from the Department of External Communications decided to get together to discuss the article in the newspaper and the possible reasons for its publication. The chairman of Epicleon, Kim, could not have imagined what had happened and did not see any problems at all. Of course, Jim had his own version of the matter, but he expected that maybe the opinions of the other guys would coincide with his observations. Nothing special happened, but Elsa was the first to find a clue and remind her of the scandal that had recently erupted against the backdrop of corruption at the university. As expected, the girl had a good flair because our main character adhered to the same version. And the fact was that a few days ago, there was an unpleasant incident in the student council of the university. Preparations for the annual festival were in full swing, and it was necessary to choose a company that would provide stage equipment. However, it turned out that the student council had received a bribe from some supplier, and as it turned out, such machinations were carried out on a regular basis. Mass discontent grew among students, and there were calls for the resignation of dishonest leaders. Jim and Elsa's arguments did not impress Kim. He could not grasp what all this story was about and how it related to the newspaper article. It turns out that as a result of the unrest, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper was replaced, and now it is a classmate of the president of the student council. As a result, Kim suggested that the newspaper article was nothing more than an attempt to divert students' attention from the problems of the student council. And deciding to leave this topic alone, Elsa concluded that she needed to deal with a startup and not waste time on empty worries. This whole situation and the endless interference from the outside were very exhausting for the chairman of Epicleon. But Jim certainly felt that the student council was as interested in public opinion within the school as anyone else. If you divert attention to an article in the newspaper, the excitement will not subside from this. And here, apparently, a completely different meaning was hidden, not yet clear to the guys. Only one thing Jim made clear, arguing that we should expect the worst, and the article is only part of a larger picture, and perhaps a third party is involved here. Meanwhile, in the office of the student council, the still acting head David was yelling at some student. He demanded an explanation of why one of the 5-member clubs refused to cooperate with them, although the others had long agreed. The assistant calmly said that this was the decision of the head of the club to play go, and apparently he did it intentionally. Such a turn was not part of David's plans, and he immediately called the head of the club a bastard who did not play his game of capturing territory well. Something had to be done, and he ordered the student to get a good board, for example, made of nutmeg, and bribe them. A good game board cost quite a lot, and the guy objected, referring to the lack of money for such expenses. David was not satisfied with this answer, and he ordered the assistant responsible for accounting and student contributions to scrape the bottom of the barrel. In this whole scam, only the accountant was afraid of the consequences. And even if contributions were collected in advance, problems with accounting could arise later. The enraged head of the student council was saving his head and believed that now was not the time to think about the consequences. He only demanded to get $100,000, and he didn't care about budget constraints when a huge jackpot was at stake. In addition, the accountant guy had to make sure that the student council did not fail the ethics hearing. Unable to resist David's pressure, the assistant agreed to do everything, and left the office with an unpleasant feeling. Left alone and using his shaky power, the leader dialed the phone number of his classmate. The newly elected editor-in-chief of the university newspaper had long prepared a new article and was waiting for the team to publish it. Acting on a clear plan, David commanded that it was time to publish the next article. The next morning, the latest issue of the university newspaper was not on the table only of a lazy student. As expected, another article was published about the introduction of a system of restrictions on financial support for clubs from the outside, and the guys immediately gathered to discuss its content. With tension in his voice, Kim read that according to the student council, funds in excess of the established limit will be divided between clubs. All the management, including the president of the board, had to resign, and Jim immediately realized that this was a well-thought-out bribe for the heads of clubs. It was getting hotter, and a trickle of sweat flowed down Kim's face, because in fact, the heads of clubs are nothing more than a lifeline for drowning people. It turned out that in exchange for receiving a share of the funds offered to Jim for Epiclean, the clubs would help the bribe takers keep their places. The children's reasoning was interrupted by a phone call coming from the pocket of a first-year student. Elsa's number was determined on the screen, and hurrying to answer, the guy heard excitement in her voice. In front of the student council office, she read an announcement that Epiclean was creating a sense of discomfort at the university. But the most unexpected thing for the guys was that all the arguments were set out and signed by the joint club committee. Elsa no longer spoke, but shouted into the phone that the student council had persuaded all the heads of the club, and even those with whom they had good relations, now do not make contact. Immediately, the ill-fated triangle formed in Jim's head, consisting of the student council, the university newspaper, and the joint club committee. Epiclean was cornered, and the way out of this situation was not easy for the guys. The first couple of first-year students had a management class, and Jim and Oliver, as usual, sat next to each other. The teacher quickly turned the pages of the textbook, but unexpectedly abandoned this unpretentious task. Instead of lectures on management, he asked if there were students from the club, around which there was a fuss lately. The question was so unexpected that Oliver was speechless and only sighed, unable to utter a word. Quietly whispering to his friend not to rush and sit silently, Jim decided to take the attack on himself. He raised his hand, identifying himself to the teacher and all the students present at the lecture. The young teacher was interested in the sensations experienced by a first-year student, a member of the Epiclean Club. The students around were aggressive and looked reproachfully at the guys, especially Oliver. No matter how presumptuous it may sound, but the self-confident protagonist wanted to hear the opinion of others on this matter. Fearing attacks from first-year students, the friend asked only one question, namely why. The teacher was thinking about returning to his direct duties and did not seem to expect further dialogue. But Jim persisted in talking about the articles published in the university paper, citing their weak arguments. Deciding to postpone the lecture material for another day, the young teacher confidently closed the textbook. This was followed by an invitation to the audience to speak out about the incident and possibly help solve the problem. The awkward silence of the audience was broken by a guy in a green sweater who expressed the opinion that Epiclean is very different from other clubs. The second student immediately added that support from the outside makes others feel uncomfortable, comparing a special attitude. After such statements, the teacher invited Jim to comment on the arguments he heard. However, the guy decided to abstain and just listen to others, since the opinion of the club representative, as an interested person, could be regarded differently. The girl sitting behind her friends raised her hand and was indignant that Epiclean valued belonging to a club more than to a university. But Jim considered the club to be an organization that received support from the educational institution, and according to her, it turned out the opposite. The same guy in a green sweater believed that it was necessary to introduce a salary system, set a limit on outside support, and share funds in excess of the limit. What the main character assumed began, and it did not matter whether it was common sense or not, only the compliance with his own interests was important. The students around applauded the bold statements of their comrades in arms, as the idea of dividing the money was to everyone's liking. Suddenly, quietly, Oliver jumped up from his seat and, banging his hands loudly on the table, he demanded to stop the unpleasant conversation. Drawing attention to himself, he once again, in a calmer manner, asked to end the discussions of his classmates. Upset and depressed, he headed for the exit from the classroom, leaving his friend alone with the attacking students. Oliver waited for the end of the lecture on a bench in the courtyard of the university building until his friend sat down next to him. Jim asked him to explain why the guy reacted to the opinions of students, which is not at all characteristic of his upbringing. But the classmate answered the question with a question about life and studies in high school, which only childhood friend Ethan could know about. Wondering where the details of his youth had come from, Jim did not immediately hear Oliver tell the story of his escape from the extortionists. When it dawned on him, he immediately remembered the humble boy from the alley where the extortionists were trying to take away pocket money. As it turned out, the guys had known each other for a long time, but Jim did not have time to ask the name of his ward then. That incident gave Oliver self-confidence, and he strove to become like his savior. But as it turned out, the guy has not changed at all, and the proof of this is today's act, when he left a friend alone to be torn to pieces by students. The main character assured the guy that everything was fine and it was impossible to kill a person with just one look. But there was something else that made Oliver feel a huge responsibility, and that fact directly affected the management of the Palace Group. In fact, he was the son of the chairman of the largest corporation, the Palace Group, because of which Epiclean experienced continuous trouble. Unable to believe his own ears, Jim almost fell off the bench, asking him to repeat the news he had heard. However, the young master was not a noble child born in wedlock. In other words, he was an illegitimate son from his father's mistress. Even at the first meeting with the first-year students, the senior noted the young student, and it turns out that everyone, except for close friends, knew who he was. Oliver did not want to deceive his friend and apologize for not telling about his origins earlier. It is difficult to talk about this, and the guy admitted that it seems to him that he experiences discomfort precisely because of such a relationship. Jim calmed the guy, noting his individuality and human qualities. Otherwise, they would not have become close friends. They also talked about the money that the father regularly transferred, but at the same time never maintained personal ties with his son. Life is difficult and not always clear, so a friend instead of his father gladly offered his support. After a frank conversation, the guys hurried to share the news with Ethanem, who almost choked from what he heard. To say that a childhood friend was surprised is to say nothing. After pouring lemonade, Ethan wiped his dirty face and the guys quietly chuckled at such a positive reaction. In any case, jokes are good, but Jim had one very important task for his friend, which did not require delay. The very next day, meeting in Epicleon, Chairman Kim studied the most detailed information about the editor-in-chief of the newspaper named Max. In the Department of Literature, many students were members of the Newspaper News Society, and after talking to the seniors, Ethan got something interesting. Before being appointed to the position, Max had a very good reputation, and Elsa doubted the veracity of the information about him. Ethan read aloud fragments of phrases about how the head of the newspaper was a big lover of alcohol and a Lego fan. Then a continuous anecdote was written that he was from Texas, and once, while walking on the weekend, he was bribed by Lego on the outskirts of the city. The guys could not help laughing, believing that there was little plausible information written here. Having laughed enough, Jim took the initiative into his own hands and continued to read about some incredible story about Max's grandmother. And again, the main character had doubts about the veracity of the story, and he looked at his childhood friend questioningly. Ethan explained that he learned this information from an undergraduate who often heard stories about his grandmother over a drink. Glancing at Max's file again, Jim suddenly had a good idea, and it seemed to him that it was a win-win. Hurrying to share his ideas with friends, he said that he had come up with the props that the Palace Group needed. While the guys were developing a strategy to rehabilitate themselves among the students, the head of the student council was having lunch in complete calm. Without having time to bring another spoon to his mouth, an assistant ran into the office with a newspaper in his hands, declaring from the doorway about the problems that had arisen. Without giving David a proper meal, he rambled about a front-page report about Epicleon. Anticipating the content of the article, at some second, even the food seemed tastier to the president of the student council. But he was wrong, as the excited student began to wave his arms categorically, declaring the opposite nature of the article. Maintaining friendship with the editor-in-chief, David could not allow anything other than negativity towards Epicleon and, taking the newspaper in his own hands, began to read. The enraged president read in huge letters on the front page, a headline that the members of the club had come up with an incredible business item. After a while, having worked hard, the Epicleon Club was visited by an honored guest, about whose arrival Kim hastened to warn the guys. The students carefully prepared for the meeting with him, wearing snow-white shirts for such an important occasion. With a confident gait, not a young man in a business suit, approached the chairman of the club to greet each other. Inviting him to go to a meeting with the guys, Kim was very nervous, and they bowed devotedly, afraid to raise their heads. The visitor was not the leader of the group, but the president of the Palace Group Corporation, Mr. Thompson, and in order for the guys to relax, he joked about it. Looking at an adult businessman, respectable and rich, Jim could not believe that he was the father of his close friend. Then simple and sincere words of gratitude poured in for the work done and the excellent idea brought to life. In the past, when Thompson publicly apologized for his ill-mannered son's boorish behavior, he looked very different. Feeling ashamed, he was saddened to realize that a loved one was making mistakes and carrying the burden of wrong decisions. But today, the president of the corporation was cheerful and courteous, expressing recognition of Kim's conscientious work and high achievements. However, the chairman of Epicleon was not going to collect all the honors single-handedly, knowing a real hero who deserved praise. But when Kim looked in Jim's direction, Jim shook his head to the left and right and pointed his finger in the opposite direction. Opposite, modestly lowering his head, stood the illegitimate son of President Thompson, who had never seen his father, to whom the main character pointed with an invisible sign.